Chapter 38, Part 2 of The Cloven Foot by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 38, Part 2. Celia's Lovers. "A very decent person," remarked Celia. "Not a bit like the popular notion of a burglar, but perhaps not altogether unlike the real thing. A respectable appearance must be a great advantage to a criminal." "There it is!" cried Laura joyfully. "What?" "The carriage! Yes, I'm sure. Yes, he's coming. Let's run on to the gate, Celia." They ran as fast as a brace of schoolgirls and arrived at the gate in a flutter of excitement, just in time to see the neat little brougham turn into the avenue. "Jack!" cried Laura. "Stop!" cried Jack, with his head out of the window, and the coachman pulled up his horses as his master jumped out of the carriage. "Come out, Sampson," said Mr. Traverton. "We'll walk to the house with the ladies." He put his wife's hand through his arm and walked on, leaving Celia to Mr. Sampson's escort. They had much to say to each other, husband and wife, in this happy meeting. John Traverton was in high spirits, full of delight at returning to his wife, full of triumph in the thought that no one could oust him from the home they both loved. Tom Sampson walked in the rear with Miss Clare. She was dying to question him as to where he and his client had been and what they'd been doing, but felt that to do so would be bad manners, and knew that it would be useless. So she confined herself to general remarks of a polite nature. "I hope you have had what the Yankees call a good time, Mr. Sampson," she said. "Very much so, thanks, Miss Clare," answered Sampson, recalling a dinner eaten at Véfour's just before leaving Paris on the previous evening. "The cuisine is really first class." If there was one word Celia hated more than another, it was this last odious adjective. "You came by the 4 o'clock express from Waterloo, I suppose?" hazarded Celia. "Yes, and a capital train it is." "Ah," sighed Celia, "I wish I had a little more experience of trains. I stick in my native soil till I feel myself fast becoming a vegetable." "No fear of that," exclaimed Mr. Sampson. "Such a girl as you, all life and spirit and cleverness, no fear of your ever assimilating to the vegetable tribe. There's my poor sister Eliza now. There's a good deal of the vegetable about her. Her ideas run in such a narrow groove. I know before I go down to breakfast of a morning exactly what she'll say to me, and I get to answer her mechanically. At dinner again we sit opposite each other like a couple of talking automatons. It's a dismal life, Miss Clare, for a man with any pretense to mind. If you only knew how I sometimes sigh for a more congenial companion." "But I don't know anything about it, Mr. Sampson," answered Celia tartly. "How should I?" "You might," murmured Sampson tenderly, "if you had as much sympathy with my ideas as I have with yours." "Nonsense!" cried Celia. "What sympathy can there be between you and me? We haven't an idea in common. A business man like you, with his mind wholly occupied by leases and draft agreements and wills and writs and things, and a girl who doesn't know an iota of law." "That's just it," exclaimed Sampson. "A man in my position wants a green spot in his life, a haven from the ocean of business, what's its name? In the barren desert of legal transactions. I want a home, Miss Clare. A home." "How can you say so, Mr. Sampson? I'm sure you have a very comfortable house and a model housekeeper in your sister." "A young woman may be too good a housekeeper, Miss Clare," answered Sampson seriously. "My sister is a little over-conscientious in her housekeeping. In her desire to keep down expenses, she sometimes cuts things a little too fine. I don't hold with waste or extravagance. I shudder at the thought of it. But I don't like to be asked to eat rank salt butter on a Saturday morning because the regulation amount of fresh has run out.
and Eliza won't allow another £half to be had in till Saturday afternoon. That's letting a virtue merge into a vice, Miss Clare."
"Poor Miss Sampson. It's quite too good of her to study your purse so carefully."
"So it is, Miss Clare," answered the solicitor doubtfully. "But I see ribbons round Eliza's neck and bonnets upon Eliza's head that I can't always account for satisfactorily to myself. She has a little income of her own, as you no doubt know, since everybody knows everything at Hazelhurst, and she's made her little investments in cottage property out of her little income, which, as you may also know, is derived from cottage property, and she has added a cottage here and a cottage there, till she is swelling out into a little town, as you may say. Well, I should think she must have 25 tenements in all, and I sometimes ask myself how she manages to invest so much of her little income, and yet to dress so smart. There isn't a better dressed young lady in Hazelhurst, present company, of course, excepted, than my sister. You may have noticed the fact."
"I have," replied Celia, convulsed with inward laughter. "Her bonnets have been my admiration and my envy."
"No, Miss Clare, not your envy," protested Sampson, with exceeding tenderness. "You can envy no one. Perfection has no need to envy. It must feel its own superiority. But I was about to observe, in confidence, that I would rather the housekeeping money was spent on butter than on bonnets, and that when I feel myself deprived of any little luxury, it is a poor consolation to know that my self-denial will provide Eliza with a neck ribbon. No, my dear Miss Clare, the hour must come when my sister will have to give up the keys of her cupboards at the Laurels and retire to a home of her own. She is amply provided for. There will be no unkindness in such a severance. You know the old proverb, 'Two's company, 3 is none.' It doesn't sound grammatical, but it's very true. When I marry, Eliza will have to go."
"But you are not thinking of matrimony yet awhile, I hope, Mr. Sampson?"
"Yet awhile," echoed Sampson. "I'm 33. If I don't take the business in hand now, Miss Clare, it will be too late. I'm thinking of matrimony, and have been thinking of it very constantly for the last 6 months. But there's only one girl in the world that I would care to marry, and if she won't have me, I shall go down to my grave a bachelor."
"Don't say that," cried Celia. "That is deciding things much too hastily. You haven't seen all the girls in the world. How can you know anything about it? Hazelhurst is such a narrow sphere. A man might as well live in a nutshell and call that life. You ought to travel. You ought to see the world of fashion. There are charming boarding-houses at Brighton now where you would meet very stylish girls. Why don't you try Brighton?"
"I don't want to try Brighton or anywhere else," exclaimed Mr. Sampson, with a wounded air. "I tell you I am fixed as fate. There is only one girl in this magnificent universe I want for my wife. Celia, you must feel it. You must know it. You are that girl."
"Oh, I am so sorry," cried Celia. "This is quite too dreadful."
"It is not dreadful at all. Don't be carried away by the first shock of the thing. I may have been too sudden, perhaps. Oh, Celia, I have worshipped too long in silence, and I may, perchance—" Mr. Sampson rather dwelt on the perchance, which seemed to him a word of peculiar appropriateness, almost a lapse into poetry. "I may, perchance, have been too sudden in my avowal. But when a man is as much in earnest as I am, he does not study details. Celia, you must not say no."
"But I do say no," protested Celia.
"Not an irrevocable no."
"Yes, a most irrevocable no. I am very much flattered, of course, and I really like you very much, as we all do, because you are good and true and honest. But I never, never, never could think of you in any other character than that of a trustworthy friend."
"Do you really mean it?" asked poor Sampson, aghast. He was altogether crushed by this unexpected blow. That any young lady in Hazelhurst could refuse the honor of an alliance with him had never occurred to him as within the range of possibility. He'd taken plenty of time in making up his mind upon the matrimonial question. He'd been careful and deliberate, and had waited till he was thoroughly convinced that Celia Clare was precisely the kind of wife he wanted, before committing himself by a serious declaration. He'd been careful that his polite attention should not be too significant until the final die was cast. His journey to Brittany had given him ample leisure for reflection. Prostrate in his comfortable berth on board the St. Malo steamer, in the dim light of the cabin lamp, lulled by the monotonous oscillation of the steamer, he'd been able to contemplate the question of marriage from every standpoint, and this offer of tonight was the result of those meditations. Celia told him, with all due courtesy, that she really did mean to refuse him. "You might do worse," he said dolefully.
"No doubt I might. Some rather vulgar person has compared matrimony to a bag of snakes in which there is only one eel. Perhaps you are the one eel, but then you see I am not obliged to marry anybody. I can go on like Queen Elizabeth, in maiden meditation, fancy free."
"That's not likely," said Mr. Sampson moodily. "A young lady of your stamp won't remain single. You're too attractive and too lively. No, you'll marry some scamp for the sake of his good looks, and perhaps the day will come when you'll remember this evening and feel sorry that you rejected an honest man's offer." They were at the house by this time, much to Celia's relief, as she felt that the conversation could hardly be carried on further without unpleasantness. She stopped in the hall and offered her hand to her dejected admirer.
"Shake hands, Mr. Sampson, to show that you bear no malice," she said. "Be assured I shall always like and respect you as a friend of our family." She did not wait for his answer, but tripped lightly upstairs, determined not to make her appearance again that evening. Tom Sampson was inclined to return to his own house, without waiting to say good night to his client. But while he stood in the hall making up his mind on this point, John Traverton came out of a dining-room to look for him. "Why, Sampson, what are you doing out there?" he cried. "Come in and have some supper. You haven't eaten much since we left Paris." "Much," echoed Sampson dismally. "A segment of hard biscuit on board the boat and a cup of weak tea at Dover have been my only sustenance. But I don't feel that I care about supper," he added, surveying the table with melancholy eye. "I ought to be hungry, but I'm not." "Why, you seem quite low-spirited, Mr. Sampson," said Laura kindly.
"I am feeling a little low tonight, Mrs. Traverton."
"Nonsense, man! Low-spirited on such a night as this, after the triumph you achieved at Auray? Wasn't it wonderful, Laura, that Sampson's acumen should have hit upon the idea of my first marriage being invalid? It was the only chance we had, the only thing that could have saved the estate."
"Of course it was," replied Sampson, "and that was why I thought of it. A lawyer is bound to see every chance, however remote. I don't know that in my own mind I thought it really likely that your first wife had been encumbered with a living husband when you married her, but I saw that it was just the one loophole for your escape from a most confounded fix."
Cheered by the idea that he had saved his client's fortune, and comforted by a tumbler or two of irreproachable champagne, Mr. Sampson managed to eat a very good supper, and he trudged briskly homewards on the stroke of midnight, tolerably content with himself and life in general.
"Perhaps, after all, I may be better off as a bachelor than with the most fascinating of wives," he reflected. "But I must come to an understanding with Eliza. Cheese-paring is all very well as long as my cheese is not pared. I must let Eliza know that I'm master, and that my tastes ought to be consulted in every particular. When I think of the melted butter they gave me last night at Vifour's, And the sauce with that sole normande. I shudder at the recollection of the bill sticker's paste I've been asked to eat at my own table. If Eliza is to go on keeping house for me, there must be a revolution in the cookery." John Traverton and his wife spent a Sabbath of exceeding peacefulness. They appeared at church together morning and evening, much to the discomfiture of Edward Clare, who was surprised to see them looking so happy. "Does he think the storm has blown over?" Edward said to himself. "Poor wretch, he will discover his mistake before long." The vicar went to the manor house after the evening service, and he and John Traverton were closeted together in the library for an hour or more, during which time John told his wife's trustee all that had happened at Auray, and showed him documents which proved Marie Pommelec's marriage with Jean Kergariou, and Kergariou's death 2 years after her second marriage. "Providence has been very good to you, John Traverton," said the vicar when he'd heard everything. "You cannot be too grateful for your escape from disgrace and difficulty. But I hope you will always remember that your own sin is not lessened by this discovery. I hope that you honestly and truly repent that sin." "Can I do otherwise?" asked John Traverton sadly. "Has it not brought fear and sorrow upon one I love better than myself? The thing was done to benefit her, but I feel now that it was not the less dishonorable." "Well, we will try to forget all about it," said the good-natured vicar, who, in exhorting a sinner to repentance, never wished to make the burden of remorse too heavy. "I only desired that you should see your conduct in a proper light, as a Christian and a gentleman. God knows how grateful I am to him for his mercy to you and my dear Laura. It would have almost broken my heart to see you turned out of this house." "Like Adam and Eve out of paradise," said Traverton, smiling, "and my poor Eve a sinless sufferer." After the serious talk, the vicar and his host went back to the drawing-room, where Laura and Celia were sitting by a glorious wood fire reading Robertson's sermons. "What a darling he was!" cried Celia with a gush. "And how desperately in love with him I should have been if I'd lived at Brighton in his time and heard him preach. His are the only sermons I could read without feeling bored. If that dear prosy old father of mine would only take a lesson—" Her father's entrance silenced her just as she was about to criticize his capabilities as a preacher. The vicar went straight to Laura and took both her hands in his hearty grasp. "My dear, dear girl," he said, "Providence has ordered all things well for you. You have no more trouble to fear." It was not till the next morning that Laura remembered her husband's anxious tenant from Beachhampton. Husband and wife were breakfasting together tête-à-tête in the book-room at 7:30. John Traverton dressed in his hunting gear, ready to start for a 6-mile ride to the meet of staghounds among the pasture-clad hills. Celia, who did not consider that her obligations as a guest included early rising, was still luxuriating in morning dreams. "Oh, by the by," exclaimed Laura, when she and her husband had talked about many things, "I quite forgot to tell you about your tenant at Beachhampton. He's coming to see you at 9 o'clock this morning. It's a rather important matter he wants to see you about, he says. He's been extremely anxious for your return." "My tenant at Beachhampton, dear?" said John Traverton with a puzzled air. "Who can that be? I have no property at Beachhampton except ground rents, and Sampson collects those. I have nothing to do with the tenants." "Yes, but this is something about drainage, and your tenant wants to see you. He said you were the ground landlord of some houses which he holds." John Traverton shrugged his shoulders resignedly. "Rather a bore," he said, "but if he is here at 9 o'clock, I don't mind seeing him. I shan't wait for him. I've ordered my horse at 9 sharp, and I've ordered the pony carriage for you and Celia to drive to the meet. It's a fine morning, and the fresh air will do you good." "Then I'd better send a message to Celia," said Laura. "She's given to late hours in wintry weather." She rang the bell and told Trimmer to send one of the maids to Miss Clare to say that she was to be ready for a drive at 9 o'clock. and then John and his wife dawdled over their talk and breakfast till 8:30, by which time the January sun was bright enough to invite them into the garden. "Run and put on your sealskin, Laura, and come for a turn in the grounds," said Mr. Traverton. The obedient wife departed, and came back in 5 minutes in a brown cloth dress, with a jacket, hat, and muff of darkest sealskin. "What a delightful study in brown," said John. They went out into the Dutch garden, that garden where John Traverton had walked alone on the morning after his first arrival at Hazelhurst, the garden where he had seen Laura standing under the yew-tree arch in the glad April sunshine. They passed under the arch today, and made the circuit of the orchard, and speculated as to how long it would be before the primroses would brighten the grassy banks, and the wild purple crocuses break through the sod, like imprisoned souls rising from a wintry grave. Never had they been happier together, perhaps never so happy, for John Traverton's mind was no longer burdened with the secret of an unhappy past. Today it seemed to both as if there was not a cloud on their horizon. They strolled about orchard and garden until the church clock struck 9, and then John went straight to the hall door, where his handsome bay stood waiting for him, and where Laura's ponies were rattling their bits and shaking their pretty little thoroughbred heads, in a general impatience to be doing something, were it only running away with the light basket carriage to which they were harnessed. "Oh, there is your tenant," said Laura, as she and her husband came round the gravel drive from the adjacent garden, "standing at the hall door waiting for you." "Is that he?" exclaimed Traverton. "He looks uncommonly like a Londoner." "Well, my good fellow," he began, going up to the man, hunting crop in hand, ready to mount his horse, "what is your business with me? Please make it as short as you can, for I've 6 miles to ride before I begin my day's work." "I shall be very brief, Mr. Traverton," answered the stranger, coming close up to the master of Hazelhurst Manor, and speaking in a low and serious tone, "for I want to catch the up train at 11:30, and I must take you with me. I'm a police officer from Scotland Yard, and I am here to arrest you on suspicion of having murdered your wife, known as Mademoiselle Chicot, at Cibber Street, Leicester Square, on the 19th of February, 1870. John Traverton turned deadly pale, but he faced the man without flinching. "I'll come with you immediately," he said, "but you can do me one favor. Don't let my wife know the nature of the business that takes me to London. I can get it broken to her gently after I am gone." "Don't you think you'd better tell her yourself?" suggested the detective, in a friendly tone. "She'll take it better from you than from anyone else. I've always found it so. Tell her the truth, and let her come to London with us if she likes." "You are right," said Traverton. "She'll be happier near me than eating her heart out down here. You've got someone with you, I suppose. You didn't reckon upon taking me single-handed." "I didn't reckon upon your making any resistance. You're too much of a gentleman and a man of the world. I've no doubt you can clear yourself when you come before a magistrate, and that the business will go no further. It was your being absent from the inquest, you know, that made things look bad against you." "Yes, that was a mistake," answered Traverton. "I've got a man inside," said the detective. "If you'll step into the parlor and have it out with your wife, he can wait in the hall. Perhaps you wouldn't mind ordering a trap of some kind to take us to the station. It might look better for you to go in your own trap." "Yes, I'll see to it," assented John Traverton absently. "Answer me one question, there's a good fellow. Who set Scotland Yard on my heels? Who put you up to the fact that I am the man who called himself Chicot?" "Never you mind how we got at that, sir," replied the detective sagely. "That's a kind of thing we never tell. We got the straight tip, that's all you need know. It don't make no difference to you how we got it, does it now?" "Yes," said John Traverton, "it makes a great difference. But I dare say I shall know all about it before long." This ends Chapter 38, Part 2. Chapter 39 of The Cloven Foot by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 39 On Suspicion. Mr. Traverton's hunter was taken back to his loose box, where he executed an energetic pas seul with his hind legs, in the exuberance of his feelings at being let off his day's work. Mr. Traverton himself was closeted with his wife in the book-room, but not alone. The man from Scotland Yard was present throughout the interview, while his subordinate, a respectable-looking young man in plain clothes, paced quietly up and down the corridor outside. Laura bore this last crushing blow as she had borne the first, with a noble heroism. She neither wept nor trembled, but stood by her husband's side, pale and steadfast, ready to sustain and comfort him, rather than to add to his burden with the weight of her own grief. "I am not afraid, John," she said. "I am almost glad that you should face this hideous charge. Better to be put upon your trial and prove yourself innocent, as I know you can, than to live all your life under the shadow of a groundless suspicion." She spoke boldly, yet her heart sickened at the thought that it might not be easy, perhaps not even possible, for her husband to prove himself guiltless. She remembered what had been said at the time of the murder, and how every circumstance had seemed to point at him as the murderer. "My dearest, I shall be able to confront this charge," answered John Traverton. "I have no fear of that. I made a miserable mistake in not facing the difficulty at the time. The business may be a little more troublesome now than it would have been then, but I'm not afraid. I would not ask you to go to London with me, darling, if I feared the result of my journey." "Do you think I would let you go alone in any case?" asked Laura. She was thinking that even if this trouble were to end in the scaffold, she would be with him to the last, clinging to him and holding by him as other brave women had held by their loved ones, face to face with death. But no, it would not come to that. She was so convinced in her own mind of his innocence that she could not suppose there would be much difficulty in proving the fact in a court of law. "You will take your maid with you, of course," said Traverton. "Yes, I should like to take Mary." "Where am I to be during this inquiry?" asked Traverton, turning to the detective. "At the House of Detention, Clerkenwell." "Not the most desirable neighborhood, but it might be worse," said Traverton. "They are surely not going to put you in prison, John, before they have proved anything against you?" cried his wife, with a look of horror. "It's only a form, dear. We needn't call it prison. But I shan't be exactly at large. I think perhaps the best plan would be for you to take quiet lodgings at Islington, say in Colebrook Row, for instance. That's a decent place. You'd prefer that to an hotel, wouldn't you?" "Infinitely." "Very well. You'd better put up at the Midland Hotel tonight, and tomorrow morning you and Mary can drive about in the cab till you find a nice lodging. I shall write a line to Sampson, asking him to follow us as soon as he can. He may be of use to us in London." Everything was settled as quietly as if they'd been starting on a pleasure trip. The brougham was at the door in time to take them to the station. Celia, who was ready dressed to drive to the meet, was the only person who appeared excited or bewildered. "What does it all mean, Laura?" she asked. "Have you and Mr. Traverton gone suddenly mad? At 8 o'clock you send up to tell me you're going to take me to the meet, and at 9 I find you're starting for London with 2 strange men. What can you mean by it?" "It means very serious business, Celia," Laura answered quietly. "Do not worry yourself about it. You will know everything by and by." "By and by," echoed Celia scornfully. "I suppose you mean when I go to heaven and look down upon you with a new pair of eyes? I want to know now. By and by will not be the least use. I remember when I was a child, if people told me I should have anything by and by, I never got it." "Good-bye, Celia dearest. John will write to your father."
Yes, and my father will keep the letter all to himself. When will you be back?
Soon, I hope, but I cannot say how soon. Now, madam, said the police officer, the time is up. Laura embraced her friend and stepped into the carriage. Her husband followed, then the detective, and lastly the faithful Mary, who had had hard work to get a couple of portmanteaus packed for her master and mistress, and a few things huddled into a carpet-bag for herself. She had no idea where they were going, or the motive of this sudden journey. A few hasty words had been said to Trimmer as to the conduct of the household, and that was all. At the station, Mr. Paulby, the detective, contrived to secure a compartment for Mr. and Mrs. Traverton and himself. His subordinate was to travel with Mary in a second-class carriage. "You needn't be afraid of his talking," said Mr. Paulby to his prisoner. "Grummel's is as close as wax." "It can matter very little whether he talks or not," answered Traverton indifferently. "Everybody will know everything in a day or two. The newspapers will make my story public." He thought with supreme bitterness how much easier it would have been for him to face this accusation as Jack Chicot than as John Traverton, alias Chicot. How much less there would have been for the newspapers to say about him had he stood boldly forward at the inquest and faced his difficulty. About Jacques Chicot, the literary bohemian, the world would have been little curious. How much greater was the scandal now that the accused was a man of fortune, a country squire, the bearer of a good old name. At 5 o'clock that winter afternoon, the doors of the house of detention closed upon John Traverton. There was some deference shown to the accused even here, and much consideration for the lovely young wife, who remained quietly with her husband to the last moment, and gave vent to none of the lamentations which were wont to disturb the orderly silence of those stony halls. Laura made herself acquainted with the rules and regulations to which her husband would be subject, the hours at which she would be allowed to see him, and then bade him good-bye without a tear. It was only when she and Mary were alone in the cab, on their way to the Midland Hotel, that her fortitude broke down and she burst into convulsive sobs. "Oh, please don't," cried Mary, putting her friendly arms round her mistress. "You mustn't give way. Indeed, you mustn't. It's so dreadful bad for you. Everything's bound to come right, ma'am. Look at master, how cheerful he is, and how brave and handsome he looked in that horrid place." "Yes, Mary, he pretended to be cheerful and confident for my sake, just as I tried to keep myself calm in order to sustain him. But it is a mere pretense on both sides. I shall be a miserable woman until this inquiry is over." "Well, ma'am, of course it's an anxious time." "We've hardly a friend who can help us. What does Mr. Sampson know of criminal law? What's my husband know as to what he ought to do to protect himself in his present position? We are like children lost in a dark wood, a wood where there are beasts of prey that may devour us." "Mr. Sampson seems very clever, ma'am. Depend upon it, he'll know what to do." "Lor, what an ugly place this London is!" exclaimed Mary, looking with astonished eyes at the architectural beauties of the Gray's Inn Road. "Everything's so dark and smoky. Chjapter is ever so much grander." Here the cab turned into the Euston Road, and the palatial front of the Midland Hotel revealed itself in a burst of splendor to Mary's astonished eyes. "My!" she exclaimed, "it must be Buckingham Palace, surely." Her astonishment became stupefaction when the cab drove under the Italian Gothic portico, and a liveried page sprang forward to open the door and relieve bewildered Abigail of her mistress's travelling bag. Her surprise and admiration went on increasing, like a geometrical progression, commencing above Unity, as she followed her mistress across the pillared hall and up the marble staircase to a corridor whose remote perspective ended far away in a twinkling speck of gaslight. "Gracious, what a place!" she cried. "If all the hotels in London are like this, what must the Queen's Palace be?"
The polite German attendant opened the door of a sitting room, where a bright fire burned, as if to welcome expected guests. He had softly murmured the word sitting room into Laura's ear as she crossed the hall, and she bowed gently in assent. No more was needed. He felt she was the right sort of customer for the Grand Midland. "The pet home is within," he said, indicating a door of communication. "There is also dressing room. There will be a room wanted for the maid, madam, I suppose. I will send the chambermaid. Madame will wish to dine?" "No, thanks. You can bring some tea," answered Laura, sinking wearily into a chair. She kept her veil down to hide her tear-stained cheeks. "If a gentleman called Sampson should inquire for me in the course of the evening, please send him here."
"Yes, madame. What name?"
"What man? Oh, you mean my own name. Traverton. Mrs. Traverton." She shuddered at the thought that in a few days the name might be notorious. Mary ordered a dish of cutlets to be sent up with the tea, and presently she and the chambermaid were arranging Mrs. Treverton's bedroom, opening the portmanteau, setting out the ivory brushes and silver-topped bottles from the travelling bag, and giving a look of comfort and homeliness to the strange apartment. Fires were lighted in the bedroom and dressing-room, and there was that all-pervading air of luxury which to the traveller of limited means suggests the idea that, for the time being, he's living at the rate of 10,000 a year. The evening was sad and weary for Laura Treverton. Now only was she beginning to realize the catastrophe that had befallen her. Now only, as she walked up and down the strange sitting-room, alone, friendless, in the big world of London, did all the horror of her position come home to her. Her husband, a prisoner, charged with the most direful offense man can commit against his fellow-man, to be brought, perhaps tomorrow, to face his accusers, and to have the details of his supposed guilt bandied from lip to lip tomorrow night, the subject of idle wonder and foolish speculations. He, her darling, degraded to the lowest depth to which humanity can fall. It was too horrible. She clasped her hands before her eyes, as if to shut out an actual scene of horror. The dock, the judgment seat, the hangman, and the scaffold. "My husband suspected of such a crime," she said to herself. "My husband, whose inmost thoughts are known to me, a man incapable of cruelty to the meanest thing that crawls." Sometimes, in the course of those slow hours, a sudden excitement took hold of her. She forgot everything except the one fact of her husband's position. "Let us go to him, Mary," she cried. "Get me my hat and jacket, and let us go to him directly."
"Indeed, ma'am, we can't get in," remonstrated Mary. "Don't you remember what they told us about the hours of admission? You were only to see him at a particular time. Why, they're all abed by this time, poor things, I make no doubt."
"How cruel!" cried Laura. "How cruel it is that I can't be with him!"
"If you go on worrying yourself like this, ma'am, you'll be ill. You haven't eaten a bit since you left home, though I'm sure the cutlets was done lovely. Shall I order some arrowroot for your supper? Or a basin of soup, now? That would be more nourishing."
"No, Mary, it's no use. I can't eat anything. How I wish Mr. Sampson would come."
"It's almost too late to expect him, ma'am. I don't suppose he's left Hazelhurst. Perhaps he couldn't get away today."
"Not get away?" echoed Laura. "Nonsense! He would never abandon my husband in this hour of difficulty." The German waiter at this very moment announced,
"Mr. Sampson."
"I'm awfully late, Mrs. Treverton," said the little man, bustling in, "but I thought you'd like to see me, so I came in. I've engaged a room in the hotel, and I shall stay as long as I'm wanted, even if my Hazelhurst business goes to pot." "How good you are! You have only just come to London?"
"Only just come, indeed. I came by the train after yours. I was in London at 7 o'clock. I've been with Mr. Leopold, the well-known solicitor. The man who's so great in criminal cases, you know. And I've got him for our side. And I've been down to Cibber Street with him, and we've picked up all the information we can. The landlady's laid up with low fever, and so we couldn't get much out of her. But we've seen Mr. Gerard, and we know pretty well what he is to bring forward against us, and I think he'll be rather a reluctant witness. It's a pity that Mr. Desrolles is out of the way. We might have made something out of him.
Laura turned to him with a startled look. Desrolles? That was the name by which her husband had known her father. He, to whom an alias seemed so easy, had been known in his London lodgings as Mr. Desrolles, and he'd been in the house at the time of the murder. "You have no fear as to the result, have you?" Laura asked Sampson with intense anxiety. "My husband will be able to prove himself innocent of this terrible crime."
"I don't believe the other side will be able to prove him guilty," said Sampson thoughtfully.
"But he may remain all his life under the stigma of this hideous suspicion. The world will believe him guilty, though the crime cannot be brought home to him. Is that what you mean?"
"My dear Mrs. Traverton, I am not clever enough or experienced enough to offer an opinion in such a case as this. We are only at the outset of things. Besides, I am no criminal lawyer."
"What does Mr. Leopold say?" asked Laura, looking at him intently.
"I am not at liberty to tell you that. It would be a breach of confidence," answered Sampson.
"I see. Mr. Leopold thinks there is a strong case against my husband."
"Mr. Leopold thinks nothing at present. He has no data to go upon."
"He must remember the report of the inquest and all that was said in the newspapers."
"Mr. Leopold thinks that of the newspapers," exclaimed Sampson, snapping his fingers. "Mr. Leopold is not led by the nose by the newspapers. He would not be where he is if he were that kind of man."
"Well, we must wait and hope," said Laura with a sigh. "It is a hard trial, but it must be borne. Will anything be done tomorrow?"
"There will be an inquiry at Bow Street."
"Will Mr. Leopold be present?"
"Of course. He will watch the case as a cat watches a mouse."
"Tell him that I should think half my fortune too little to reward him if he can prove, clearly and plainly prove, my husband's innocence."
"Mr. Leopold won't ask for your fortune. He's as rich as, well, rolling in money. He'll do his duty, you may depend upon it, without any prompting from me."
This ends Chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Cloven Foot by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 40. Mr. Leopold asks irrelevant questions. An inquiry was held at Bow Street next day. Several of the witnesses who had appeared nearly a year ago at the inquest were present, and much of the evidence that had been then given was now repeated. The policeman who had been called in by Desrolles, the doctor who had first examined the dead woman's wound, and the detective who examined the premises. All these gave their evidence exactly as they had given it at the inquest. Mrs. Evitt was too ill to appear, but her previous statements were read. There was one witness present on this occasion who had not appeared at the inquest. This was George Gerard, who had been subpoenaed by the prosecution and who described, with a somewhat reluctant air, his discovery of a dagger in Jacques Chicot's color box.
"This was a curious discovery of yours, Mr. Gerard,"
asked Mr. Leopold, after the witness had been examined,
"and comes to light at a curious time. Why did you not inform the police of this discovery when you made it?"
"I was not called as a witness."
"No, but if you considered this discovery of yours of any importance, it was your duty to make it known immediately. You make your way into the house of the accused without anybody's authorization. You go prying and peering into rooms that have already been examined by the police. and you come forward a year afterwards with this extraordinary discovery of a tarnished dagger. What evidence have we that this dagger ever belonged to the accused?"
"There need be no difficulty about that," said John Traverton. "The dagger is mine." Mr. Leopold rewarded his client's candor with a ferocious scowl. Was there ever such a man? A man who was legally dumb, whose lips the law had sealed, and who had the folly to blurt out such an admission as this? The magistrate asked whether the dagger could be found. The police had taken possession of all Jack Chicot's chattels. The dagger was no doubt among them.
"Let it be found and given to the divisional surgeon to be examined," said the magistrate.
The inquiry was adjourned at the request of Mr. Leopold, who wanted time to meet the evidence against his client. The magistrate, who felt that the case was hardly strong enough for committal, granted this respite. An hour later, John Traverton was closeted with Mr. Leopold and Mr. Sampson in his room at Clerkenwell.
"The medical evidence shows that the murder must have been committed at 1 o'clock, said Mr. Leopold. "You only discovered it at 5 minutes before 3. What were you doing with yourself during those hours? At the worst, we ought to be able to prove an alibi."
"I am afraid that would be difficult," answered Traverton thoughtfully. "I was very unhappy at that period of my life, and had acquired a habit of roaming about the streets of London between midnight and morning. I had suffered from a painful attack of sleeplessness, and this night roving was the only thing that gave me relief. I was at a literary club near the Strand on the night of the murder. I left a few minutes after 12. It was a fine, mild night, wonderfully mild for the time of year, and I walked to Hampstead Heath and back."
"Humph!" muttered Mr. Leopold. "You couldn't have managed things better if you wanted to put the rope round your neck. You left your club a few minutes after 12, you say. In comfortable time for the murder. You were seen to leave, I suppose?"
"Yes, I left with another member, a watercolor painter who lives at Haverstock Hill."
"Good. And he walked with you as far as Haverstock Hill, I suppose?"
"No, he didn't. We walked to St. Martin's Church together, and there he took a hansom. He had no latchkey and wanted to get home in decent time."
"Did you tell him you were going to walk up to the Heath?"
"No, I had no definite purpose. I walked as far and in whatever direction my fancy took me."
"Precisely. Then your friend, the watercolor painter, parted from you at about 12:15?
"It struck the quarter while we were wishing each other good night."
"Within 5 minutes' walk of your lodging. No chance of an alibi here, I fear, Mr. Traverton, unless you met anyone on Hampstead Heath, which in the middle of the night was not very likely."
"I neither met nor spoke to a mortal, except a man at a coffee stall near the Mother Redcap, on my way back."
"Ah, you talked to a man at a coffee stall, did you?"
"Yes, I stopped to take a cup of coffee at 10 minutes past 2. If the same man is to be found there, he ought to remember me. He was a loquacious fellow, something of a wag, and we had quite a political discussion. There'd been an important division in the House the night before, and my friend at the coffee stall was well posted in his Daily Telegraph." Mr. Leopold made a note of the circumstance while John Traverton was talking.
"So far, so good. Now we come to another point. Is there anybody whom you suspect is implicated in this murder? Can you trace a motive anywhere for such an act?"
"No," answered Traverton decidedly.
"Yet you see the murder must have been done by someone, and that someone must have had a motive. It was not a case of suicide. The medical evidence at the inquest clearly demonstrated that."
"You remember the inquest?"
"Yes, I was present."
"Indeed!" exclaimed Traverton, surprised.
"Yes, I was there. Now, to continue my argument. You, as the husband of the victim, must have been familiar with all her surroundings. You must know better than anyone else whether there was anyone connected with her who could have a motive for this crime."
"I cannot conceive any reason for the act. I cannot suspect any one person more than another."
Are you positive that your wife had no valuables in her possession? Money, for instance."
"She spent her money faster than she earned it. We were always in debt. The little jewelry she had ever possessed had been pledged."
"Are you sure that she had no valuable jewelry in her possession at the time of her death?"
"To my knowledge she had none."
"That's curious," said Mr. Leopold. "I heard a rumor at the time of a diamond necklace which had been seen round her throat 2 or 3 evenings before the murder by the dresser at the theatre. Your wife wore a broad band of black velvet round her neck when she was dressed for the stage, which entirely concealed the diamonds, and it was only by accident the dresser saw them."
"This must be a fable," said Traverton. "My wife never possessed a diamond necklace. She was never in a position to buy one."
"She may have been in a position to receive one as a gift," suggested Mr. Leopold quietly.
"She was an honest woman."
"Granted. Such gifts are given to honest women. Not often, perhaps, but the thing is possible. Her possession of that diamond necklace may have become known to the murderer and may have tempted him to the crime."
Traverton was silent. He remembered his wife's anonymous admirer, the giver of the bracelet. He had dismissed the man from his thoughts after his interview with the jeweler. No other gifts had appeared, and he had felt no further uneasiness on the subject.
"Have you thought of all the people in the house?" asked Mr. Leopold.
John Traverton shrugged his shoulders. "What can I think about them? No one in the house could have had any motive for murdering my wife."
"It's pretty clear that the murder was not done by anyone outside the house," said Mr. Leopold, "unless, indeed, the street door had been left open in the course of the evening, so as to enable the murderer to slip in quietly and hide himself until everyone had gone to bed. At what time did your wife generally return from the theatre?"
"About 12 o'clock. Oftener before 12 than after."
"The murderer may have followed her into the house. She had a latchkey, I suppose?"
"Yes."
"She may have been careless in closing the door and left it unfastened. It's quite possible that someone may have entered the house after her and left it quietly when his work was done."
"Quite," answered Traverton, with a bitter smile. "But if we do not know who that someone was, the fact won't help us."
"How about this man who occupied the second floor, this Desrolles? What is he?"
"A broken-down gentleman?" asked Traverton, with a troubled look. He had a peculiar reluctance in speaking of Desrolles.
"He could not be anything worse," said Mr. Leopold sententiously. "This Desrolles was in the house at the time of the murder. Strange that he should have heard nothing of the struggle."
"Mrs. Rawber heard nothing, yet she was on the floor below, and was more likely to hear any movement in my wife's room."
"I should like to know all you can tell me about Desrolles," said Mr. Leopold, frowning over his pocketbook.
Honest Tom Sampson sat and listened, open-eyed and silent. To him, the famous criminal lawyer was a god, a being made up of wisdom and knowledge. "I can tell you very little," answered John Traverton. "I know nothing to his discredit except that he was poor, and too fond of brandy for his own welfare."
"I see," answered Leopold quickly. "The kind of man who would do anything for money."
Traverton started. He could not deny that this was in some wise true of Mr. Desrolles, alias Mansfield, alias Malcolm. It horrified him to remember that this man was Laura's father, and that at any moment the disgrace of that relationship might be made known, should Desrolles' presence at the police court be insisted upon. Happily, Desrolles was on the other side of a channel, where only the solicitor who received his income knew where to find him. Mr. Leopold asked a good many more questions, some of which seemed frivolous and irrelevant, but all of which John Traverton answered as well as he was able. "I hope you believe in me, Mr. Leopold," he said, when his solicitor held out his hand at parting.
"From my soul," answered the other earnestly. "And what's more, I mean to pull you through this. It's a troublesome business, but I think I can see my way to the end of it. I wish you could help me to find Desrolles."
"That I cannot do," said Traverton decidedly.
"It's a pity." Well, good day. The inquiry is adjourned till next Tuesday, so we have a week before us. It will be hard if we don't do something in that time."
"The police have done very little in a 12-month," said Traverton.
"The police have not a monopoly of human intelligence," answered Mr. Leopold. "We may do better than the police."
2 advertisements appeared in the Times, Telegraph, and Standard next morning.
Desrolles, £10 reward will be given to anybody furnishing the present address of Mr. Desrolles, late of Cibber Street, Leicester Square.
To jewelers, pawnbrokers, etc. Lost in February 1870.
A cullet necklace of imitation diamonds. Anybody giving information about the same will be liberally rewarded.
This ends Chapter 40. Chapter 41, Part 1 of The Cloven Foot by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 41, Part 1. Mrs. Evitt makes a revelation. Mrs. Evitt was very ill. It may be that a prolonged residence on a level with the sewers and remote from the direct rays of the sun is not conducive to health or good spirits. Mrs. Evitt had long suffered from a gentle melancholy and all-pervading dolefulness, which impelled her to hang her head on one side and to sigh faintly at intervals without any apparent motive. She had been also prone to see all the affairs of life in their darkest aspect, as one living remote from the sun might naturally do. She had been given to prophesy death and doom to her acquaintance, to give a sick friend over directly the doctor was called in, to foresee sheriff's officers in ruin at the slightest indication of extravagance in the management of a neighbor's household, to augur bad things of babies and worse things of husbands, to mistrust all mankind, and to perform under her human aspect that ungenial office which the screech owl was supposed to fulfill in a more romantic age. She had always been ailing. She suffered from vague pains and stitches and undefinable aches, which took her at awkward angles of her bony frame, or which racked the innermost recesses of that edifice. She knew a great deal more about her internal economy than is consistent with happiness, and was wont to talk about her liver and other organs with an almost professional technicality. She was not an agreeable companion, but a long succession of lodgers had borne with her, because she was tolerably clean and unscrupulously honest. Upon this last point she prided herself immensely. She knew that she belonged to a maligned and suspected race, nay, that the very name of her calling was synonymous with peculation, and her soul swelled with pride as she declared that she had never wronged a lodger by so much as a crust of bread. She would let a mutton bone rot in her larder rather than appropriate the barest shank without express permission. Rashers of bacon, half-pounds of Dorset, lard, flour, eggs were as safe in her care as bullion in the Bank of England. George Gerard, to whom every penny was of consequence, had discovered the sovereign virtue in his landlady and honoured her for it. He had suffered much from the harpies with whom he had dwelt in the city. He found his half-pound of tea or coffee last twice as long as in former lodgings, his rasher of bacon less costly, his mutton chop better cooked, his loaf respected. For him Mrs. Evitt was a model landlady, and he rewarded her integrity by such small civilities as lay in his power. What gratified her most was his readiness to prescribe for those ailments which were the most salient feature of her life. Her mind had a natural bent towards medicine, and she loved to talk to the good-natured surgeon of her disorders, or even to question him about his patients.
"That's a bad case of smallpox you got in Green Street, isn't it, Mr. Gerard?" she would say to him, with a dismal relish, when she came in after his day's work to ask what she ought to do for that grumbling pain in her back.
"Who told you it was smallpox?" asked Gerard.
"Well, I had it from very good authority. The charwoman that works at number 7 in this street is own sister to Mrs. Jewell's Mary Ann, and Mrs. Jewell and Mrs. Peacock in Green Street is bosom friends, and the house where you're attending is exactly opposite Mr. Peacock's."
"Excellent authority," answered Gerard, smiling. "But I am happy to tell you I haven't a case of smallpox on my list. Did you ever hear of such a thing as rheumatic fever?"
"Hear of it!" echoed Mrs. Evitt rapturously. "I've been down with it 7 times." She looked very hard at him as she made the assertion, as if not expecting to be believed.
"Have you?" said Gerard. "Then I wonder you're alive."
"That's what I wonder at myself," answered Mrs. Evitt, with subdued pride. "I must have had a splendid constitution to go through all I've gone through, and to be here to tell it. The quinsys I've had! Why, the mustard that's been put to my throat in the form of poultices would stock a first-rate tea grocer with the article. As to fever, I don't think you could name the kind I haven't had since I had the scarlatina at 5 months old and the whooping cough atop of the measles before I'd got over it. I've been a martyr."
"I'm afraid that damp kitchen of yours has had something to do with it," suggested Gerard.
"Damp!" cried Mrs. Evitt, casting up her hands. "You never made a greater mistake in your life, Mr. Gerard, than when you threw out such a remark. There ain't a drier room in London. No, Mr. Gerard, it ain't damp, it's sensitiveness. I'm a regular sensitive plant, and if there's disease going about, I take it. That's why I asked you if the smallpox was in Green Street. I don't want to be disfigurated in me old age."
Mr. Gerard looked upon Mrs. Evitt's ailments as in a large degree imaginary, but he found her weak and overworked, and gave her a gentle course of quinine, ill as he could afford to supply her with so expensive a tonic. For some time the quinine had a restorative effect, and Mrs. Evitt thought her lodger the first man in his profession. That young man understood her constitution as nobody else had ever understood it, she told her gossips, and that young man would make his way. A doctor who had understood a constitution which had hitherto baffled the faculty was bound to achieve greatness. Unfortunately, the good effect of Gerard's prescription was not lasting. There was a good deal of wet and foggy weather at the close of the old year and at the beginning of the new year, and the damp and fog crept into Mrs. Evitt's kitchen and seemed to take hold of her hard-worked old bones. She exhibited some very fine examples of shivering. Her teeth chattered, her complexion turned blue with cold. Even 3 pennyworth of Best's unsweetened gin, taken in half a tumbler of boiling water, failed to comfort or exhilarate her.
"I'm afraid I'm in for it," Mrs. Evitt exclaimed to a neighbour, who had dropped in to pass the time of day and borrow an Italian iron. "And this time it's ague."
And then, forcing the attack a little for the benefit of the neighbour, she set up one of those dreadful shivering fits which rattled all the teeth in her head.
"It's ague this time," she repeated, when the shivering had abated. "I never had ague till now." "Nonsense!" cried the neighbour, with an assumption of cheerfulness. "It ain't ague. Lord bless you, people don't have ague in the heart of London, in a warm, comfortable kitchen like this. It's only in marshes and such places that you hear of ague." "Never you mind," retorted Mrs. Evitt solemnly. "I've got the ague, and if Mr. Gerard don't say as much when he comes home, he isn't the clever man I think him."
Mr. Gerard came home in due course, letting himself in quietly with his latchkey, soon after dark. Mrs. Evitt managed to crawl upstairs with a tray, carrying a mutton chop, a loaf, and a pat of butter. To cook the chop had cost her an effort, and it was as much as she could do to drag her weary limbs upstairs. "Why, what's the matter with you tonight, Mrs. Bouncer?" asked Gerard, who had given his landlady that classic name. "You're looking very queer."
"I know I am," answered Mrs. Evitt, with gloomy resignation. "I've got the ague."
"Ague? Nonsense!" cried Gerard, rising and feeling her pulse. "Let's look at your tongue, old lady. That'll do. I'll soon set you on your legs again, if you do what I tell you.
What's that?
Get to bed, and stay there till you're well. You're not fit to be slaving about the house, my good soul. You must get to bed and keep yourself warm, and have someone to feed you with good soup and arrowroot and such like.
Who's to look after the house? Asked Mrs. Evitt dismally.
I shall be ruined. No, you won't. I'm your only lodger just now. Mrs. Evitt sighed dolefully. And I want very little waiting upon. You'll want someone to wait upon you, though. You'd better get a charwoman. 8 pence a day, 3 substantial meals, and a pint of beer, sighed Mrs. Evitt.
I should be 8 out of house and home. If I must lie up, Mr. Gerard, I'll get a girl. I know of a decent girl that would come for her victuals and a trifle at the end of the week.
Ah, said Gerard, there are a good many decent young men walking the streets of London who would go anywhere for their victuals. Life's a harder problem than any proposition in Euclid, my worthy bouncer. The landlady shook her head in melancholy assent. Now, look here, my good soul, said Gerard seriously. If you want to get well, you mustn't sleep in that kennel of yours down below.
Kennel? Cried the outraged matron. Kennel, Mr. Gerard? Why, you might eat your dinner off the floor.
I dare say you might, but every breath you draw there is tainted more or less with sewer gas. That front tongue of yours looks rather like blood poisoning. You must make yourself up a comfortable bed on the first floor, and keep a nice little bit of fire in your room, day and night.
Not in her room, Mr. Gerard, exclaimed Mrs. Evitt with a shudder. I couldn't do it, sir. It isn't like as if I was a stranger. Strangers wouldn't feel it, but I knew her. I should see her beautiful eyes glaring at me all night long. It would be the death of me.
Well, then, there's Desrolles' room. You can't have any objection to that.
Mrs. Evitt shuddered again.
I'm that nervous, she said, that my mind's set against those upstairs rooms. You'll never get well downstairs. If you don't fancy that first-floor bedroom, you can make yourself up a bed in the sitting-room. There's plenty of light and air there.
I might do that, said Mrs. Evitt, though it goes against me to act my beautiful drawing-room.
You won't hurt your drawing-room. You have to recover your health.
Health is a blessed privilege. Well, I'll put up a trottle bed in the first-floor front. The girl could sleep on a mattress on the floor at the bottom of my bed. She'd be company.
Of course she would. Make yourself comfortable, mentally and bodily, and you'll soon get well. Now, how about this girl? You must get her immediately.
I've got a neighbour coming in presently. I'll get her to step round and tell Jemima to come.
Is Jemima the girl?
Yes. She's stepdaughter to the tailor at the corner of Cricket's Row. He's got a fine family of his own, and Jemima feels herself one too many. She's a hard-working, honest-minded girl, though she isn't much to look at. Her father was in the public line. He was barman at the Prince of Wales, and the stepfather throws it at her sometimes when he's in drink.
Never mind Jemima's biography, said Gerard. Get your neighbour to fetch her, and in the meantime I'll help you to make up the bed.
Law, Mr. Gerard, you haven't had your tea. Your chop will be stone cold.
My chop must wait, said Gerard cheerily. And then, with all the handiness of a woman, and more than the kindness of an ordinary woman, the young surgeon helped to transform the first-floor sitting-room into a comfortable bedchamber. By the time this was done, Jemima had arrived upon the scene, carrying all her worldly goods tied up in a cotton handkerchief. She was a raw-boned, angular girl, deeply marked with the smallpox. Her scanty hair was twisted into a knot like a ball of cotton at the back of her head. Her elbows were preternaturally red. Her wrists were bound up with rusty black ribbon. But she had a good-natured grin that atoned for everything. She was as patient as a beast of burden, contented with the scantiest fare, invariably cheerful. She was so accustomed to harsh words and hard usage that she thought people who did not bully or maltreat her the quintessence of kindness. It was on the evening when Mrs. Evitt took to her bed, and the house was entrusted to the care of Jemima, that Mr. Leopold and Mr. Sampson came to make their inquiries at the house in Cibber Street. George Gerard saw them and heard of John Treverton's arrest with considerable surprise and some indignation. He felt assured that Edward Clare must have given the information upon which the police had acted, and he felt angry with himself for having been in some wise a cat's paw to serve the young man's malice. He remembered Laura's lovely face, with its expression of perfect purity and truth, and he hated himself for having helped to bring this terrible grief upon her. "There was a time when I believed John Treverton guilty," he told Mr. Leopold, "but I have wavered in my opinion ever since last Sunday week, when he and I talked together."
"You never would have thought badly of him if you'd known him as well as I do," said the faithful Sampson. "He has stayed for a week at a stretch in my house, you know. We've been like brothers. This is an awkward business, and of course it's very painful for that sweet young wife of his. But Mr. Leopold means to pull him through."
"I do," assented the famous lawyer.
"Mr. Leopold has pulled a great many through, innocent and guilty."
"And guilty," assented the lawyer, with quiet self-approval. He was disappointed at not being able to see Mrs. Evitt. "I should like to have asked her a few questions," he said. "She's much too ill tonight for that kind of thing," answered Gerard. "Her only chance of recovery is to be kept quiet, and I don't think she can tell you any more about the murder than she stated at the inquest." "Oh, yes, she could," said Mr. Leopold. "She would tell me a great deal more." "Do you think she kept anything back?" "Not intentionally, perhaps, but there's always something untold, some small detail which to your mind might mean nothing, but which might mean a great deal to me. Please let me know directly I can see your landlady." Gerard promised, and then Mr. Leopold, instead of taking his departure, made himself quite at home in the surgeon's armchair, and stirred the small fire with so reckless a hand that poor Gerard trembled for his weekly 100 of coals. The solicitor seemed in an idle humor, and inclined to waste time. Honest Tom Sampson wondered at his frivolity. The conversation naturally turned upon the deed which had given that house a sinister notoriety. Gerard found himself talking freely of Madame Chicot and her husband, and it was only after Mr. Leopold and his companion had gone that he perceived how cleverly the experienced lawyer had contrived to cross-question him without his being aware of the process. After this evening, Gerard watched the newspapers for any report of the Chicot case. He read of John Treverton's appearance at Bow Street, and saw that the inquiry had been adjourned for a week. At Mrs. Evitt's particular request, he read the report of the case in the evening papers on the night after the inquiry. She seemed full of anxiety about the business. "Do you think they'll hang him?" she asked eagerly. "My good soul, they've a long way to go before they get to hanging. He's not even committed for trial." "But it looks black against him, doesn't it?" "Circumstances certainly appear to point to him as the murderer. You see, there seems to be no one else who could have had any motive for such an act." "And you say he's got a sweet young wife?" "One of the loveliest women I ever saw. I feel very sorry for her, poor soul." "If you was on the jury, would you bring him in guilty?" asked Mrs. Evitt. "I should be sorely perplexed. You see, I should be called upon to find my verdict according to the evidence, and the evidence against him is very strong." Mrs. Evitt sighed and turned her weary head upon her pillow. "Poor young man," she murmured. "He was always affable, not very free-spoken, but always affable. I should feel sorry if it went against him. It would be awful, wouldn't it?" she exclaimed with sudden agitation, lifting herself up from her pillow and gazing fixedly at the surgeon. "It would be awful for him to be hung, and innocent all the time, and a sweet young wife too. I couldn't bear it." No, I couldn't bear it. The thought of it would wind me down to my grave, and I don't suppose it would let me rest even there.
Gerard thought the poor woman was getting delirious. He laid his fingers gently on her skinny wrist and held them there while he looked at his watch. Yes, the pulse was a good deal quicker than it had been when he last felt it.
"Is Jemima there?"
asked Mrs. Evitt, twitching aside the bed curtain and looking nervously round. Yes, Jemima was there, sitting before the fire, darning a coarse grey stocking and feeling very happy in being allowed to bask in the warmth of a fire in a room where nobody threw saucepan lids at her. George Gerard had rigged up what he called a jury curtain to shelter the truckle bed from those piercing currents of air which find their way alike through old and new window frames. Mrs. Evitt's thin fingers suddenly fastened like claws upon the surgeon's wrist.
"I want to speak to you," she whispered. "By and by, when Jemima's gone down to her supper. I can't keep it any longer. It's prying on my vitals."
The delirium was evidently increasing, thought Gerard. There was generally this exacerbation of the fever at nightfall. "What is it you can't keep?" he asked soothingly. "Is there anything that worries you?"
"Wait till Jemima has gone down," whispered the invalid.
"I'll come up and have a look at you between 10 and 11, said Gerard aloud, rising to go. "I've a lot of reading to get through this evening." He went down to his books in his tranquil solitude, pondering upon Mrs. Evitt's speech and manner. No, it was not delirium. The woman's words were too consecutive for delirium. Her manner was excited, but not wild. There was evidently something on her mind, something connected with Lachicot's murder. Great heaven! Could this feeble old woman be the assassin? Could those withered old hands have inflicted that mortal gash? No, the idea was not to be entertained for a moment. Yet stranger things have been since the world began. Crime, like madness, might give a factitious strength to feeble hands. Lachicot might have had money, jewels, hidden wealth of some kind, of which the secret was known to her landlady, and, tempted by direst poverty, this wretched woman might— The thought was too horrible. It took possession of George Gerard's brain like a nightmare. Vainly did he endeavor to beguile his mind by the study of an interesting treatise on dry rot in the metatarsal bone. His thoughts were with that feeble old woman upstairs, whose skinny hand just now had set him thinking of the witches in Macbeth. This ends Chapter 41, Part 1. Chapter 41, Part 2 of The Cloven Foot by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 41, Part 2. Mrs. Evitt makes a revelation. He listened for Jemima's clumping footfall going downstairs. It came at last, and he knew that the girl was gone to her meagre supper, and the coast was clear for Mrs. Evitt's revelation. He shut his book and went quietly upstairs. Never until now had George Gerard known the meaning of fear, but it was with actual fear that he entered Mrs. Evitt's room, dreading the discovery he was going to make. He was startled at finding the invalid risen, and with her dingy black stuff gown drawn on over her night-gear. "Why in heaven's name did you get up?" he asked. "If you were to take cold, you would be ever so much worse than you have been yet."
"I know it," answered Mrs. Evitt, with her teeth chattering, "but I can't help that. I've got to go upstairs to the second floor back, and you must go with me."
"What for?"
"I'll tell you that presently. I want you to tell me something first."
Gerard took a blanket off the bed and wrapped it round the old woman's shoulders. She was sitting in front of the fire, just where Jemima had sat darning her stocking.
"I'll tell you anything you like," answered Gerard, "but I shall be very savage if you catch cold."
"If an innocent person was suspected of a murder, and the evidence was strong against him, and another person knew he hadn't done it and said nothing, and let the law take its course, would the other person be guilty?"
"Of murder," cried Gerard, "of nothing less than murder. Having the power to save an innocent life and not saving it, what could that be but murder?"
"Are you sure Jemima isn't outside on the listen?" asked Mrs. Evitt suspiciously. "Just go to the door and look."
Gerard obeyed. "There's not a mortal within earshot," he said. "Now, my good soul, don't waste any more time. It's evident you know all about this murder."
"I believe I know who did it," said the old woman.
"Who?"
"I can remember that awful night as well as if it was yesterday," began Mrs. Evitt, making strange swallowing noises as if to keep down her agitation. "There we all stood on the landing outside this door, Mrs. Robber, Mr. Desrolles, me, and Mr. Chicot. Mrs. Robber and me was all of a twitter. Mr. Chicot looked as white as a ghost. Mr. Desrolles was the coolest among us. He took it all quiet enough, and I felt it was a comfort to have somebody there that had his wits about him. It was him that proposed sending for a policeman."
"Sensible enough," said Gerard.
"Nothing was further from my thoughts than to suspect him," pursued Mrs. Evitt. "He'd been with me off and on for 5 years, and he'd been a quiet lodger, coming in at his own time with his own key, and giving very little trouble. He had only one fault, and that was his liking for the bottle. He and Madame Chicot had been very friendly. He seemed to take quite a fatherly care of her, and had brought her home from the theatre many a night, when her husband was at his club."
"Yes, yes," cried Gerard impatiently. "You've told me that often before tonight. Go on, for heaven's sake. Do you mean to say that Desrolles had anything to do with the murder?"
"He did it," said Mrs. Evitt,
whispering into the surgeon's ear. "How do you know? What ground have you for accusing him?"
"The best of grounds. There was a struggle between that poor creature and her murderer. When I went in to look at her as she lay there, before the doctor had touched her, one of her hands was clenched tight, as if she had clutched at something in her last gasp. In that clenched hand I found a tuft of iron grey hair, just the colour of Desrolles' hair. I could swear to it."
"Is that all your evidence against Desrolles? The fact is strongly in favour of poor Traverton, and you were a wicked woman not to reveal it at the inquest. But you cannot condemn Desrolles upon the strength of a few grey hairs, unless you know of other evidence against him."
"I do," said Mrs. Evitt. "Dreadful evidence. But don't say that I was a wicked woman because I didn't tell it at the inquest. There was nobody's life in danger. Mr. Chicot had got safe off. What should I up and tell that which would hang Mr. Desrolles? He'd always been such a good lodger to me, and though I could never look at him after that time without feeling every drop of blood in my veins turn to ice, and though I was thankful to Providence when he left me, it wasn't in me to tell that which would be his death."
"Go on," urged Gerard. "What was it you discovered?"
"When the policeman had come in and looked about him, Mr. Desrolles said, 'I shall go to bed. I ain't wanted no more here.' And he got back to his room as quiet and as cool as if nothing had happened. When the sergeant came back half an hour afterwards with the gentleman in plain clothes, which was neither more nor less than a detective, them two went into every room in the house. I went with them to show the way and to open cupboards and such like. They went up into Mr. Desrolles' room, and he was sleeping like a lamb. He grumbled a bit at us for disturbing him. 'Look about as much as you like,' he said, 'as long as you don't worry me. Open all the drawers. You won't find any of 'em locked. I haven't a very extensive wardrobe.
I can keep count of my clothes without an inventory." "A very pleasant gentleman," said the detective afterwards.
"Did they find nothing?" asked Gerard. "Nothing. Yet they looked and pried about, very careful. There's only one closet in the second floor back, and that's behind the head of the bed. The bed's a tent with chintz curtains all round. They looked under the bed, and they even went so far as to move the chimney board and look up the chimney. But they didn't move the bed. I suppose they didn't want to disturb Mr. Desrolles, who'd curled himself up in the bedclothes and gone off to sleep again." "I suppose there ain't no cupboards in this room," says the detective. I was tired of that dancing attendance upon them, that I just gave my head a shake that might mean anything. And they went downstairs to the parlours to worrit Mrs. Robber. Here Mrs. Evitt paused, as if exhausted by much speech. "Come, old lady," said Gerard kindly, "take a little of this barley water, and then go on. You're keeping me on tenterhooks." Mrs. Evitt drank, gasped 2 or 3 times, and continued. "I don't know what put it into my head, but after the 2 men was gone, I couldn't help thinking about that cupboard, and whether there mightn't be something in it that the detectives would like to have found. Mr. Desrolles came downstairs at 11 o'clock and went out to get his breakfast, as he called it, but I knew pretty well when he went out of doors for his breakfast, he breakfasted upon brandy. If he wanted a cup of tea or a bloater, I got it for him, but there was mornings where he hadn't appetite to pick a bit of bloater with a slice of bread and butter, and then he went out of doors." "Yes, yes," assented Gerard. "Pray, go on." "When he was gone, I put up the chain of the front door, so as to make sure of not being disturbed, and I went straight up to his room. I moved the bedstead and opened the cupboard door. Mr. Desrolles had no key to the cupboard, for the key was lost when he first came to me, and though it had turned up afterwards, I hadn't troubled to give it to him. What did he want with keys when all the property he had in the world wasn't worth a £5 note? Go on, there's a good soul." "I opened the cupboard. It was a queer, old-fashioned closet in the wall, and the door was papered over just the same as the room. It was so dark inside that I had to light a candle before I could see anything there. There was not much to see at first, even with the candle, but I went down upon my knees and hunted in the dark corners, and at last I found Mr. Desrolles' old chintz dressing-gown, rolled up small and stuffed into the darkest corner of the cupboard, under a lot of rubbish. He'd been wearing it only a day or 2 before, and I knew it as well as I knew him. I took it over to the window and unfolded it, and there was the evidence that told who had murdered that poor creature lying cold on her bed in the room below. The front of the dressing-gown and one of the sleeves was soaked in blood. It must have flowed in torrents. The stains were hardly dry. Good Lord, says I to myself, this would hang him, and I takes and rolls the gown up tight, and puts it back in the corner, and covers it over with other things, old newspapers and old clothes and such like, just as it was before. And then I runs downstairs and routs out the key of the closet and takes and locks it. I was all of a tremble while I did it, but I felt there was a power within me to do it. I had but just put the key in my pocket when there came a loud knocking downstairs. From the time Mr. Desrolles had gone out, it wasn't quite a quarter of an hour, but I felt pretty sure this was him come back again. I pushed back the bed and ran down to the door, still trembling inwardly. "What the wicked word did you put the chain up for?" he asked angrily, for it was him. I told him that I felt that nervous after last night that I was obliged to do it. He smelt strong of brandy, and I thought he was looking strange, like a man that feels all queer in his inside and struggles not to show it. "I suppose I must put myself into a clean shirt for this inquest," he says, and then he goes upstairs, and I wonders to myself how he feels as he goes by the door where that poor thing lies."
"Did he never ask you for the key of the closet?"
"Never. Whether he guessed what had happened and knew that I suspected him, I can't tell. But he never asked no questions, and the closet has been locked up to this day, and I've got the key. And if you'll come upstairs with me, I'll show you what I saw that dreadful morning."
No, there's no need for that. The police are the people who must see the inside of that closet."
"It's a strange business," said Gerard, "but I'm more glad than I can say for Traverton's sake, and for the sake of his lovely young wife."
What motive could the Desrolles have had for such a brutal murder?
Mrs. Evitt shook her head solemnly. "That's what I never could make out," she said, "though I've lain awake many a night puzzling myself over it. I know she hadn't no money. I know that him and her was always friendly up to the last day of her life. But I've got my idea about it."
"What is your idea?" asked Gerard.
"That it was done when he was out of his mind with delirious tremings."
"But have you ever seen him mad from the effects of drink?"
"No, never. But how can we tell that it didn't come upon him sudden in the dead of the night, and work upon him until he got up and rushed downstairs in his madness and cut that poor thing's throat?"
"That's too wild an idea. That a man should be raging mad with delirium tremens between 12 and 1 o'clock and perfectly sane at 3 is hardly within the range of possibility."
"No, there must have been a motive, though we cannot fathom it."
"Well, I thank God that conscience has impelled you to tell the truth at last, late as it is. I shall get you to repeat this statement to Mr. Leopold tomorrow. And now get back to bed, and I'll send Jemima up to you with a cup of good beef tea. God grant that this fellow Desrolles may be found."
"I hope not," said Mrs. Evitt. "If they find him, they'll hang him, and he was always a good lodger to me. I'm bound to speak of him as I found him."
"You wouldn't speak very well of him if you had found him at your throat with a razor."
"Ah," replied the landlady, "I lived in fear and dread of him ever after that horrid time. I've woke up in a cold perspiration many a time, fancying that I heard his breathing close beside my bed, though I always slept with my door locked and the kitchen table pushed against it. I was right down thankful when he went away, though it was hard upon me to have my second floor empty, and Queen's taxes and all my rights coming in just as regular as when my house was full."
Gerard insisted on his patient going to bed without further delay. She was flushed and excited by her own revelations, and would have willingly gone on talking till midnight if her doctor had allowed it. But he wished her good night, and went downstairs to summon the well-meaning Jemima, who was a very good sick nurse, having ministered to her large family of step-brothers and step-sisters through teething, measles, chicken-pox, mumps, and all the ills that infant flesh is heir to. George Gerard communicated early next day with Mr. Leopold, and that gentleman came at once to Mrs. Evitt's bedside, where he had a long and friendly conversation with that lady, who was well enough to be inordinately loquacious. She was quite fascinated by the famous lawyer, whose manners seemed to her the perfection of courtesy, and she remarked afterwards that if her own neck had been in peril, she could hardly have refused to answer any questions he asked her. Once master of his facts at first hand, Mr. Leopold called a hansom and drove to the shady retreat where his client was languishing in durance. Laura was with her husband when the lawyer came. She started up, pale and agitated, at his entrance, looking at him as the one man who was to save an innocent life.
"Good news," said Leopold cheerily.
"Thank God," murmured Laura, sinking back in her chair.
"We have found the murderer."
"Found him?" cried Traverton. "How? And where?"
"When I say found, I go rather too far," said Leopold. "But we know who he is. It's the man I suspected from the beginning, your second-floor lodger, Desrolles."
Laura gave a cry of horror.
"You need not pity him, Mrs. Traverton," said Mr. Leopold. "He's a thorough-paced scoundrel. I happen to be acquainted with circumstances that throw a light upon his motive for the murder. He's quite unworthy of your compassion. I doubt if hanging, in the gentlemanly way in which it's done now, is bad enough for him. He ought to have lived in a less refined age, when he would have had his last moments enlivened by the yells and profanity of the populace."
"How do you know that Desrolles was the murderer?" asked John Traverton. Mr. Leopold told his client the gist of Mrs. Evitt's statement. Traverton listened in silence. Laura sat quietly by, white as marble.
"The young surgeon in Cibber Street tells me that Mrs. Evitt will be well enough to appear in court next Tuesday," said Mr. Leopold, in conclusion. "If she isn't, we must ask for another adjournment. I think you may consider that you're out of it. It would be impossible for any magistrate to commit you, in the face of this woman's evidence. But Desrolles will have to be found all the same, and the sooner he's found, the better. I shall set the police on his track immediately. Don't look so frightened, Mrs. Traverton. The only way to prove your husband's innocence is to show that someone else is guilty. I wish you could help me with any information that would put the police on the right scent," he added.
"I told you yesterday that I could not help you."
"Yes, but your manner gave me the idea that you were keeping back something, that you could, and if you would, have given me a clue."
"Your imagination, despite the grim realism of police courts, must be very lively."
"Ah, I see," said Mr. Leopold. "You mean to stick to your text. Well, this fellow must be found somehow, whether you like it or not. Your good name depends upon our getting somebody convicted."
"Yes," cried Laura, starting up and speaking with sudden energy. "My husband's good name must be saved at any cost. What is this man to us, John, that we should spare him? What is he to me that his safety should be considered before yours?" "Hush, dearest," said John soothingly. "Let Mr. Leopold and me manage this business between us." This ends Chapter 41, Part 2. Chapter 42 of The Cloven Foot by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 42. The Undertaker's Evidence. "My father!" cried Laura, when Mr. Leopold had taken his departure, and she and her husband were left alone. "My father, guilty of this cruel murder, a crime of the vilest kind, without a shadow of excuse. And to think that this man's blood flows in my veins, that your wife is the daughter of a murderer. Oh, John, it is too terrible. You must hate me. You must shrink from me with loathing. Dear love, if you had descended from a long line of criminals, you would still be to me what you have been from the first hour I knew you, the purest, the dearest, the loveliest, the best of women. But as to this scoundrel Desrolles, who imposed on your youth and inexperience, who stole into your benefactor's gardens like a thief, seeking only gain, who extorted from your generous young heart a pity he did not deserve, and robbed you of your money, I no more believe that he is your father than that he is mine. While his claim upon you meant no more than an annuity which it cost us no sacrifice to give, I was too careless to trouble myself about his credentials. But now that he stands revealed as the murderer of that unfortunate woman, it is our business to explode his specious tale. Will you help to do this, Laura? I can do nothing but advise, while I am tied hand and foot in this wretched place." "I will do anything, dearest, anything to prove that this hateful man is not the father I lived with when I was a little child. Only tell me what I ought to do." "The first thing to be done is to go down to Chiswick and make inquiries there. Do you think you could find the house in which you lived, supposing that it is still standing?" "I think I could. It was in a very dull, out-of-the-way place. I can just remember that. It was called Ivy Cottage, and it was in a lane where there was never anything to be seen from the windows." "Very well, darling. What you have to do is go down to Chiswick with Samson. We can afford to trust him with all our secrets, for he's as true as steel. See if you can find the particular ivy cottage we want. I dare say there are half a dozen ivy cottages in Chiswick, all looking out upon nothing particular. And then discover all you can about your father's residence in that house, and how and when he quitted it."
"I will go today, John. Why would Mr. Samson go with me? I am not afraid of going alone."
"No, dear, I could not bear that. You must have our good Samson to take care of you. He is as sharp as a needle, and in a country where he is not tongue-tied, will be very useful. He will be here in a few minutes, and then you and he can start for Chiswick as soon as you like." Half an hour later, Laura and Mr. Samson were seated in a railway carriage on their way to Chiswick, and in less than an hour from the time she left Clerkenwell, Laura was looking wonderingly at the lanes with which her infancy had been familiar. There had been great changes, and she wandered about for a long time, unable to recognize a single feature in the scene, except always the river, which looked at her through the gray mistiness of a winter afternoon, like an old friend. Terraces had been built. Villas of startling newness stared her in the face in every direction. Where erst had been a rustic lane, there was all the teeming life of a factory.
"Surely this cannot be Chiswick!" exclaimed Laura.
Yes, there was the good old church, looking sober, grey, and rustic as of old, and here was the village, but little changed. Laura and her companion rambled on till they left the new terraces and stuccoed villas behind them, and came at last to a bit of the ancient world, quiet, dull, lonely, as if it had been left forgotten on the bank of a swift-rolling river of time.
"It must have been hereabouts we lived," said Laura.
It was a very dreary lane. There were half a dozen scattered houses, some of which had a blind look, presenting a blank wall, pierced by an odd window and a door to the passer-by. These were the more aristocratic habitations, and had gardened fronts looking the other way. A little further on, the explorers came to a square, uncompromising-looking cottage, with a green door, a bright brass knocker, and 5 prim windows looking into the lane. It was a cottage that must have looked exactly the same 120 years ago, when Hogarth was living and working hard by.
"That is the house we lived in!" cried Laura.
"Yes, I'm sure of it. I remember those hard-looking windows staring straight into the lane. I used to envy the children in the house further on, because they had a garden, only a little bit of garden, but just enough for flowers to grow in. There was only a stone yard with a pump in it at the back of our house, and not a single flower."
"Had you the whole house, do you think?" asked Samson.
"I am sure we had not, because we were so afraid to take liberties in it. I remember my poor mother often telling me to be very quiet, because Miss Somebody, I haven't the faintest recollection of her name, was very particular. I was dreadfully afraid of Miss Somebody. She was tall and straight and old, and she always wore a black gown and a black cap. I would not for the world have done anything to offend her. She kept the house very clean. Too clean, I've heard my father say, for she was always about the stairs and passages on her knees, with a pail beside her. I've often narrowly escaped tumbling into that pail."
"I wonder if she's alive still," said Samson. "The house looks as if it was in the occupation of a maiden lady. I dare say my sister's house will look like that when she set up housekeeping on her own account."
He lifted the brass knocker and gave a loudish knock. The door was opened almost immediately by a puffy widow, who had a chubby boy of 3 or 4 years old clinging to her skirts. The widow was very civil, and willing to answer any questions that might be asked her, but she could not give them the information they wanted. She begged them to come into her parlour, and she was profuse in her offer of chairs. But she was not the Miss Somebody whom Laura remembered. That stern damsel, whose name was Fry, after occupying Ivy Cottage with honour to herself and credit to the parish for 38 years, had been called to her forefathers just 1 little year ago, and was taking her rest, after an industrious career, in the quiet old churchyard where the great English painter and satirist lies. She'd left no record of a long line of lodgers, and the amiable widow who had taken Ivy Cottage immediately after Miss Fry's death was not even furnished with any traditions about the people who had lived and died in the rooms now hers. She could only reiterate that Miss Fry had been a most respectable lady, that she'd paid her way, and left the cottage in good repair, and she hoped that she, Mrs. Pugh, would continue to deserve those favours which the public had lavishly bestowed upon her predecessor. If a lady and gentleman should hear of any party wanting quiet lodgings in a rural neighbourhood, within a quarter of an hour's walk of the station, Mrs. Pugh would consider it a great kindness if they would name her to the party in question. She would have a parlour, with bedrooms over, vacant on the following Saturday. Sampson promised to carry the fact in his mind. Laura thanked the widow for her civility, and gave the chubby boy half-a-crown, a gift which was much appreciated by the mother, who impounded it directly the door was shut.
"Johnny shall have 2 pence to go and buy brandy snaps, he shall," cried the matron,
when her boy set up a howl at this blatant theft, and the prospect of that immediate and sensual gratification pacified the child. "Failure number 1, said Sampson, when they were out in the lane. "What are we to do next?" Laura had not the least idea. She felt how helpless she would have been without the kindly little solicitor, and how wise it had been of her husband to insist upon Mr. Sampson's companionship. "We are not going to be flummoxed. Excuse the vulgarity of the expression. Quite so easily," said Sampson. "Everybody can't be dead within the last 17 years. Why, 17 years is nothing to a middle-aged man. He scarcely feels himself any older for the lapse of 17 years. There are a few grey hairs in his whiskers, perhaps, and his waistcoats are a trifle bigger round the waist, and that's all. There must be somebody in this place who can remember your father. Let me think it out a bit. We want to know if a certain gentleman, who was supposed by old Mr. Traverton to have died here, did really die, or whether he recovered and left the place, as a certain party asserts. All the probabilities are in favour of the one fact, and we have only the word of a very doubtful character for the other. Let me see now, Mrs. Traverton, where shall we make our next inquiry? At the doctor's? Well, you see, there are a dozen doctors in such a place as this, I dare say. At the Undertaker's? Yes, that's it. Undertakers are long-lived men. We'll look in upon the oldest established undertaker in the village. If your father died in this place, somebody must have buried him, and the record of his funeral will be in the undertaker's books. But before I begin this business, which may be rather tedious, I should like to put you into a train and send you back to London, Mrs. Traverton. A cab will take you from the station to your lodgings. You're looking pale and tired."
"No, no," said Laura eagerly. "I'm not tired. I had much rather stay. Don't think of me. I have no sense of fatigue."
Sampson shook his head dubiously, but gave way. They went to the village, and after making sundry inquiries at the post-office, Mr. Sampson and his companion repaired to a quiet, old-fashioned-looking shop, in whose dingy window appeared the symbols of the gloomy trade conducted within. Here they found an old man, who emerged from a workshop in the rear, bringing with him the aromatic odour of elm shavings. "Come," said Sampson cheerily, "you're old enough to remember 17 years ago. You look like an old inhabitant."
"I can remember 60 years ago as well as I can remember yesterday," answered the man, "and I shall live in this house 69 years come July."
"You're the man for us," said Sampson. "I want you to look up your books for the year 1856, and tell me if you buried Mr. Malcolm of Ivy Cottage, Markham Lane. You buried Mrs. Malcolm first, you know, and the husband soon followed her. It was a very quiet funeral." The undertaker scratched his head thoughtfully, and seemed to retire into the shadowland of departed years. He ruminated for some minutes.
I can find out all about it in my ledger, he said, but I've a pretty good memory. I don't like to feel dependent upon books. Ivy Cottage? That was Miss Fry's house. I buried her a year ago. A very pretty funeral, everything suitable and in harmony with the old lady's character. Some of my oldest tradespeople followed. It was quite a creditable thing.
Samson waited hopefully while the old man pondered upon past triumphs in the undertaking line.
Let me see now, he said musingly. Ivy Cottage. I've done a good bit of business for Ivy Cottage within the last 30 years. I've buried, I should say a round dozen of Miss Fry's tenants. They was mostly elderly folks with small annuities who came to Chiswick to finish up their lives as a quiet old-fashioned place, you see, where they was in nobody's way. First and last, I should say, I've turned out a round dozen from Ivy Cottage. It was a satisfaction to do things nicely for Miss Fry herself at the wind-up. She'd been a good friend to me, and she wasn't like the doctors, you know. I couldn't offer her a commission. Malcolm, husband and wife. I ought to remember that. Yes, I've got it. A sweet young lady, 27 at the most, and the husband drooped and died soon afterwards. I remember. She had a very plain funeral, poor dear, for there didn't seem to be much money, and the husband was the only mourner. We buried him in rather superior style, I recollect, for an old friend had turned up at the last, and there was enough money to pay all the little debts and do things very nicely in a quiet way for the poor gentleman. There were only 2 mourners in his case, the doctor and an elderly lady from London who followed in her own carriage. I remember the lady because she called upon me directly after the funeral and asked if I was paid, or sure of being paid, as the deceased was her nephew, and she would be willing to perform this last act of kindness for him. I thought it a very graceful thing for the lady to do.
"Did she give you her address?" asked Samson.
I've a notion that she left her card, and that I copied the address into my book. It would be a likely thing for me to do, for I'm very methodical in my ways, and with a party of that age there's always an interest. She might come to want me herself soon, and might bear it in mind on her deathbed. Well, now I've called upon my memory, I'll look at my ledger.
He went to a cupboard in a corner of the shop and took down a volume from a row of tall, narrow books, a series which comprised the story of his life from year to year.
Yes, he said, after turning over a good many leaves. Here it is. Mrs. Malcolm, pine, covered black cloth, black nails.
"That'll do," interrupted Samson, seeing Laura's distressed look at these details. "Now we want Mr. Malcolm."
Here he is, 3 months later. Stephen Malcolm, Esquire, polished oak, brass handles. A very superior article, I remember.
"There can be no mistake, I suppose, in an entry of that kind?" asked Samson.
"Mistake!" cried the undertaker, with an offended air. "If you can find a false entry in my books, I'll forfeit 5% upon 10 years' profits."
"There can be no doubt, then, that Mr. Stephen Malcolm died at Ivy Cottage, and that you conducted his funeral?"
"Not the least doubt."
"Very well. If you will get me a certified copy of the entry of his death in the parish register, I shall be happy to recompense you for your trouble. The document is required for a little bit of law business. Is the doctor who attended Mr. Malcolm still living?"
"No, it was old Dr. Dewsnip. He's dead. But young Dewsnip is alive and in practice here. He can give you any information you want, I dare say."
"Thanks. I think if you get the copy of the register, that will be sufficient. Oh, by the way, you may as well find the old lady's address."
"Ah, to be sure. As you are interested in the family, you may like to have it. Though I dare say the old lady has gone to her long home before now. Some London firm had the job.
no doubt. London firms are so pushing, and they contrive to stand so well with the medical profession."
The address was found, Mrs. Malcolm, 97 Russell Square, and copied by Mr. Sampson, who thanked the old man for his courtesy and gave him his card, with the Midland Hotel address added in pencil. The short winter day was now closing in, and Sampson felt anxious to get Mrs. Traverton home.
"I might have gone to the parish register in the first instance," he said, when they left the undertaker's. "But I thought we should get more information out of an old inhabitant. And so we have, for we've heard of this old lady in Russell Square."
"Yes, I remember spending a week at her house," said Laura. "How long ago it seems, like the memory of another life."
"Law, yes," said Sampson. "I remember when I was a little chap at Dr. Prosford's grammar school playing chuck-farthing. I've often looked back and wondered to think that little chap, in a tight jacket and short trousers, was an early edition of me."
"You think the later editions have been an improvement on that," said Laura, smiling. She was able to smile now. A heavy load had been suddenly lifted from her mind. What infinite relief to know that her father had never been the pitiful trickster, the crawling pensioner upon a woman's bounty, that she'd been taught to think him. Her heart was full of gratitude to heaven for this discovery, so easily made and yet of such immeasurable value. "Who can that man be?" she asked herself. "He must have been a friend of my father's, in close companionship with him, or we would hardly have become possessed of my mother's miniature and of those letters and papers." She determined to go without delay to the house in Russell Square, in the hope, at best but a faint hope, of finding the old lady in black satin still among the living, and not represented by an entry in the ledger of some West End undertaking firm, or by any number in the dismal catalogue of a suburban cemetery.
This ends chapter 42.
Chapter 43 of The Cloven Foot by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 43. An Old Lady's Diary. On the following afternoon, Laura drove straight from the house of detention to Russell Square. Her interview with her husband had been full of comfort. Mr. Leopold had been with his client, and Mr. Leopold was in excellent spirits. He had no doubt as to the issue of his case, even without Desrolles, and the detectives had very little doubt of finding Desrolles.
"A man of that age and of those habits doesn't go far," said the lawyer, speaking of this human entity with as much assurance as if he were stating a mathematical truth.
Laura got out of her cab before one of the dullest-looking houses in the big, handsome old square, a house brightened by no modern embellishment in the way of Venetian blind or encaustic flower-box, but kept with a scrupulous care. Not a speck upon the window-panes, not a spot upon the snow-white steps, the varnish of the door as fresh as if it had been laid on yesterday. The door was opened by an old manservant in plain clothes. Laura grew hopeful at the sight of him. He looked like a man who had lived 50 years in one service, the kind of man who begins as a knife-boy and either stultifies a spotless career by going to America with the plate, or ends as a pious annuitant in the odor of sanctity. "Does Mrs. Malcolm still live here?" asked Laura.
"Yes, ma'am." "Is she at home?" "I will inquire, ma'am, if you will be kind enough to give me your card," replied the man, as much as to say that his mistress was a lady whose leisure was not to be irreverently disturbed. She was to be at home or not at home, as it pleased her sovereign will, and according to the quality and claims of her visitor. Laura wrote upon one of her cards, "Stephen Malcolm's daughter, Laura," while the ancient butler produced a solid old George II salver whereon to convey the card with due reverence to his mistress. The address upon the card looked respectable, and so did Laura, and upon the strength of these appearances the butler ventured to show the stranger into the dining-room,
where the furniture was of the good old Brobdingnagian stamp, and there was nothing portable except the fire-irons. Here Laura waited in a charnel house atmosphere, while Mrs. Malcolm called up the dim shadows of the past, and finally came to the determination that she would hold parley with this young person who claimed to be of her kindred. The butler came back after a chilly interval, and ushered Mrs. Traverton up the broad, ghastly-looking staircase, where drab walls looked down upon a stone-coloured carpet, to the big, bare drawing-room, which had ever been one of the coldest memories of her childhood. It was a long and lofty room, furnished with monumental rosewood. The chiffoniers were like tombs. The sofa suggested an altar. The centre table looked as massive as one of those druidic menhirs which crop up here and there among the wilds of Dartmoor or on the sandy plains of Brittany. A pale-faced clock ticked solemnly on the white marble chimney-piece. 3 tall windows let in narrow streaks of pallid daylight between voluminous drab curtains. In this mausoleum-like chamber, beside a dull and miserly-looking fire, sat an old lady in black satin, the very same figure, the very same satin gown Laura remembered years ago, or a gown so like that it appeared the same. "Aunt," said Laura, approaching timidly, and feeling as if she were a little child again, and doomed to solitary imprisonment in that awful room, "have you forgotten me?" The old lady in black satin held out her hand, a withered white hand clad in a black mitten, and adorned with old-fashioned rings. "No, my dear," she replied, without any indication of surprise. "I never forget anyone or anything. My memory is good, and my sight and hearing are good. Providence has been very kind to me. Your card puzzled me at first, but when I came to think it over, I soon understood who you were. Sit down, my dear. Johnam shall bring you a glass of sherry." The old lady rose and rang the bell. "Please don't, Aunt," said Laura. "I never take sherry. I don't want anything except to talk with you a little about my poor father." "Poor Stephen," replied Mrs. Malcolm. "Sadly imprudent, poor fellow. Nobody's enemy but his own. And so you are married, my dear? Never mind, Johnam, my niece will not take anything." This to the butler. "You were adopted by an old friend of your father's, I remember. I went to Chiswick the day after poor Stephen's death, and found that you had been taken away. I was very glad to know you were provided for, though of course I should have done what I could for you in the way of trying to get you into an institution, or something of that kind. I could never have had a child in this house. Children upset everything. I hope your father's friend has carried out his undertaking handsomely." "He was all goodness," answered Laura. "He was more than a father to me, but I lost him 2 years ago." "I hope he left you independent." "He made me independent by a deed of trust when I first went to him. He settled £6,000 for my benefit." "Very handsome indeed. And pray, whom have you married?" "My benefactor's nephew, and the inheritor of his estate." "You have been a very lucky girl, Laura, and you ought to be thankful to God." "I hope I am thankful." "I have often noticed that the children of improvident fathers do better in life than those whose parents toil to make them independent. They're like the ravens. Providence takes care of them. Well, my dear, I congratulate you." "God has been very good to me, dear aunt, but I have had many troubles. I want you to tell me about my father. Did you see much of him in the last years of his life?" "Not very much. He used to call upon me occasionally, and he used sometimes to bring your mother to spend the day with me. She was a sweet woman. You are like her in face and figure, and she and I used to get on very nicely together. She was not above taking advice." "Had my father many friends and acquaintances at that time?" asked Laura. "Many friends? My dear, he was poor." Do you know if he had any one particular friend? He could not have been quite alone in the world. I recollect there was a gentleman who used to come very often to the cottage at Chiswick. I cannot remember what he was like. I was seldom in the room when he was there. I remember only that my father and he were often together. I have a very strong reason for wishing to know all about that man. I think I know whom you mean. I have heard your poor mother talk of him many a time. She used to tell me all her troubles, and I used to give her good advice. You say you want particularly to know about this person?
Most particularly, dear aunt, said Laura eagerly.
Then, my dear, my diary can tell you much better than I can. I am a woman of methodical habits, and ever since my husband's death, 23 years ago last August, I have made a point of keeping a record of the course of every day in my life. I dare say the book would seem very stupid to strangers. I hope nobody will publish it after I am dead. But it has been a great pleasure to me to look through the pages from time to time and call up old days. It is almost like living over again. Kindly take my keys, Laura, and open the right-hand door of the chiffonier. Laura obeyed. The interior of the chiffonier was divided into shelves, and on the uppermost of these shelves were neatly arranged 23 small volumes, bound in morocco and lettered Diary, with the date of each year. The parliamentary records at Strawberry Hill are not more carefully kept than the history of Mrs. Malcolm's life. "Let me see," she said. "Your father died in the winter of 56. Your poor mother a few months earlier. Bring me the volume for 56. Laura handed the book to the old lady, who gave a gentle little sigh as she opened it. "Dear me, how neatly I wrote in 56, she exclaimed. "My handwriting has sadly degenerated since then. We get old, my dear. We grow old without knowing it." Laura thought that in that monumental drawing-room age might well creep on unawares. Life there must be a long hibernation. "Let me see. I must find some of my conversations with your mother. June 2nd. Read prayers. Breakfast. My rasher was cut too thick, and the frying was not up to cook's usual mark. Mem. Must speak to cook about the bacon. Read a leading article on indirect taxation in Times, and felt my store of knowledge increased. Saw cook. Decided on a lamb cutlet for lunch and a slice of salmon and roast chicken for dinner. Sent for cook 5 minutes afterwards and ordered sole instead of salmon. I had salmon the day before yesterday. Dear me, I don't see your poor mother's name in the first week of June, said the old lady, turning over the leaves. Here it comes, a little later, on the 15th. Now you shall hear your mother's own words, faithfully recorded on the day she spoke them. And yet there are people who would ridicule a lonely old woman for keeping a diary, added Mrs. Malcolm, with mild self-approval. I feel very grateful to you for having kept one, said Laura. June 15. Stephen brought his wife to lunch with me by appointment. I ordered a nice little luncheon. Filleted sole, cutlets, a duckling, peas, new potatoes, cherry tart, and a custard. The poor woman does not often enjoy a good dinner, and no doubt my luncheon would be her dinner. But my thoughtfulness was thrown away. The poor thing was looking pale and worn when she came, and she hardly ate a morsel. Even the duckling did not tempt her, though she owned it was the first she'd seen this year. After luncheon, Stephen went to the city to keep an appointment, as he told us, and his wife and I spent a quiet hour in my drawing-room. We had a long talk, which turned as usual on her domestic troubles. She calls this Captain Desmond her husband's evil genius, and says he is a blight upon her life. He's not an old friend of Stephen's, so there's no excuse for that foolish fellow's infatuation. They met him first at Bologna last year, and from that time to this he and Stephen have been inseparable. Poor Laura declares that this Desmond belongs to a horrid gambling, drinking set, and that he is the cause of Stephen's ruin. We were poor when we first went to Bologna, she said, with tears in her eyes, poor child. But we could just manage to live respectably, and for the first year we were very happy. But from the day my husband made the acquaintance of Captain Desmond, things began to go badly. Stephen resumed his old habits of billiard playing, cards, and late hours. He'd grown fond of his home and reconciled to a quiet domestic life. Darling Laura's pretty ways and sweet little talk amused and interested him. But after Captain Desmond came upon the scene, Stephen seldom spent an evening at home. I know that it is wicked to hate people, the poor thing said in her simple way, but I cannot help hating this bad man. Poor mother, sighed Laura, touched to the heart by this picture of domestic misery. I asked her if she knew who and what Captain Desmond was. She could only tell me that when Stephen made his acquaintance, he was living at a boarding-house at Bologna and had been living there for some months. He'd spent a considerable part of his life abroad. He had nobody belonging to him, and he seemed to belong to nobody, though he often boasted vaguely of grand connections. To poor Laura's mind he was nothing more or less than an adventurer. He flatters my husband, she said, and he tries to flatter me. He's very often at Chiswick, and whenever he comes he takes my husband back to London with him, and then I see no more of Stephen till the next day, or perhaps not for 2 or 3 days after. He has what his friends call a shakedown at Captain Desmond's lodgings in May's Buildings, St. Martin's Lane. Aunt, exclaimed Laura eagerly, will you let me copy that address? It might be of use to me if I should have to trace the past life of this man. She wrote the address in a little memorandum book contained in her purse. My dear, why should you trouble yourself about Captain Desmond? Said the old lady. Whatever harm he did your poor father is past and done with. Nothing can alter or mend it now. No, aunt, but as long as this man lives, he will go on doing harm. He will go from small crimes to great ones. It is his nature. Please go on with the diary, dear aunt. You can have no idea how valuable this information is to me. I have always felt I was doing a useful act in keeping a diary, my dear. I am not surprised to find this humble record of inestimable value, said the old lady, who was bursting with gratified vanity. Where would history be if people in easy circumstances, with plenty of leisure, did not keep diaries? I do not think there is any more about Captain Desmond. No, your mother tells me about her own health. She's feeling very low and ill. She fears she will not live many years, and then what is to become of poor little Laura? Did you ever go to Chiswick, aunt? Never, till after your poor father's death. I attended his funeral. Was Captain Desmond present? No, but he was with your father up till the last hour of his life. I heard that from the landlady. He helped to nurse him. I thank you, aunt, with all my heart for what you've told me. I will come and see you again in a few days, if I may. Do, my dear, and bring your husband. Laura shivered. I should like to make his acquaintance. If you will mention the day a little beforehand, I should be pleased for you to take your luncheon with me. I have the cook who roasted that duckling for your poor mother still with me. I shall be pleased to come, aunt. We are in London upon very serious business, but I hope it will soon be ended, and when it is over I will tell you all about it. Do, my dear. I am very glad to see you again. I dare say you remember spending a week with me when your mother died. I think you enjoyed yourself. This house must have been such a change for you after that poor little place at Chiswick, "And there is a good deal to amuse a child in this room," said Mrs. Malcolm, glancing admiringly from the monumental clock on the mantelpiece to the group of feather flowers and stuffed birds on the sepulchral chiffonier. Laura smiled faintly, remembering those interminable days in that cheerless chamber, compared with which a dirty lane where she could have made mud pies would have been Elysium. "I've no doubt you were extremely kind to me, Aunt," she said gently, "but I was very small and very shy." "And you did not like going to bed in the dark, which shows that you have been foolishly brought up. Your mother was a sweet woman, but wanting in strength of mind." This ends chapter 43.
Chapter 44 of The Cloven Foot by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 44. 3 Witnesses. In the forenoon of the following Tuesday, John Traverton again appeared before the magistrate at the police court in Bow Street. The same witnesses were present who had been examined on the previous occasion. 2 medical men gave their evidence as to the dagger which had been sent to them for examination. One declared that the blade bore unmistakable traces of bloodstains, and gave it as his opinion that steel once so sullied never lost the stain. The other stated that a steel blade wiped quickly while the blood upon it was wet would carry no such ineffaceable mark, and that the tarnished appearance of a dagger was referable only to time and atmosphere. The inquiry dragged itself haltingly towards a futile close, when just as it seemed about to conclude, an elderly woman, wrapped in a thick grey shawl and a catskin sable victorine, and further muffled with a Shetland veil tied over a close black bonnet, came forward, escorted by George Gerard, and volunteered her evidence. This was Mrs. Evitt, who was just well enough to crawl from a cab to the witness box, leaning on the surgeon's arm. "Oh," said the magistrate, when Jane Sophia Evitt had been duly sworn, "you are the landlady, are you? Why were you not here last Tuesday? You were subpoenaed, I believe." "Yes, your worship, though I was not in a state of health to bear it." "Oh, you were too ill to appear, were you? Well, what have you to say about the prisoner?" "Please, your worship, he oughtn't to be a prisoner. I ought to have up and spoke the truth sooner. It is pride upon me awful that I didn't do it. A sweet young wife, too."
"What is the meaning of this rambling?" asked the magistrate indignantly. "Is the poor creature delirious?"
"No, sir, I ain't more delirious than your worship. My body has been all of a shiver, hot fits and cold fits, but thank God my mind is kept clear."
"You really must not tell us about your ailments. What do you know of the prisoner?"
"Only that he's as innocent as that lamb yonder," said Mrs. Evitt, pointing to a baby in the arms of a forlorn-looking drab from the adjacent rookeries of St. Giles, which had just set up a shrill squall and was in process of being evicted by a policeman. "He had no more to do with it than that blessed infant that's just been carried out of court."
And then, continually beginning to wander, and being continually pulled up sharp by the magistrate, Mrs. Evitt told her ghastly story of the handful of iron grey hair and the blood-stained dressing-gown, hidden in the closet behind the bed in her 2-pair back.
"Which is there to this day, as the police may find for themselves if they like to go and look," concluded Mrs. Evitt.
"They will take care to do that," said the magistrate. "Where is this Desrolles?"
"He's being looked for, sir," replied Mr. Leopold. "If your worship will permit, there are 2 gentlemen in court who are in possession of facts that have a material bearing on this case."
"Let them be sworn."
The first of these 2 voluntary witnesses was Mr. Joseph Lemuel, the well-known stockbroker and millionaire, on whose appearance in the witness box there was a sudden hush in the court, and profound attention from everyone as at the presence of greatness.
Even that tag-rag and bobtail from adjacent St. Giles had heard of Joseph Lemuel. His name had been in the penny newspapers. He was a man who was supposed to make $1 million of money every time there was a war in Europe, and to lose $1 million whenever there was a financial crisis. "Do you know anything of this affair, Mr. Lemuel?" the magistrate asked, with an offhand friendliness, when the witness had been sworn, as much as to say, "It is really uncommonly good of you to trouble yourself about a fellow creature's fate, and I want to make the thing as light and as pleasant as I can for your sake."
"I think I may be able to afford a clue to the motive of the murderer," said Mr. Lemuel,
who seemed more moved than the occasion warranted.
"I presented the unhappy lady with a necklace about a week before her death, and I have reason to fear that this gift may have been the cause of her terrible death."
"Was the necklace of such value as to tempt a murderer?"
"It was not, but to an uneducated eye it appeared of great value. It was a gift which I offered to a lady whose talents I, as one of the outside public, enthusiastically admired."
"Naturally," assented the magistrate, as much as to say, "Don't be frightened, my dear sir. I'm not going to ask you any awkward questions."
"It was a necklace I had bought in Paris, in the Palais Royal, a short time before. It was made by a man who had a specialty for these things. It would perhaps have deceived any eye except that of a diamond merchant, and might indeed have deceived the dealer if he had judged by the eye alone. I gave £50 for the necklace. It was exquisitely set, and really a work of art."
"Did Madame Chicot suppose the stones were real?"
"I don't know. I told her nothing about the necklace. It seemed to me a suitable offering to an actress, to whom appearances are as important as realities."
"Madame Chicot made no inquiry as to the intrinsic value of your gift?"
"None. It was offered and accepted in silence."
"Is that all you have to say?"
"That's all."
The next witness was Mr. Moshe, the diamond merchant. His evidence consisted of a straight and succinct narrative of his interview with the stranger, who offered for sale a set of imitation diamonds under the impression that he was offering real stones of great value.
"These crystals were some of them equal in size to the largest diamonds known in the trade," said Mr. Moshe. "They would have been a tremendous haul for a thief, if they had been real."
He gave the date of the man's visit, which was within a week of La Chicot's murder. "Could you identify the man who called upon you with those stones?" asked the magistrate.
"I believe I could."
"Was he the prisoner?"
"Certainly not. He was a man of between 50 and 60 years of age."
"Has anybody a photograph of Desrolles?" Yes, there was a photograph in court. Mrs. Evitt had furnished the police with two, which Desrolles had given her upon different occasions. One was in court, the other had been taken by the detective who was looking for Desrolles. The photograph was shown to the witness.
"Yes," said Mr. Moshe, "I believe that to be the same face. The man who came to me wore a large gray beard. All the lower part of the face was hidden, and the beard made him look older. I conclude that it was a false beard, but to the best of my belief, that is the same man. The upper part of the face is very striking. I don't think I could be deceived in it."
After this evidence, Mr. Leopold urged that there was no ground for any longer detaining John Traverton. The magistrate, after some little discussion, agreed to this, and the prisoner was discharged. This ends chapter 44. Chapter 45 of The Cloven Foot by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 45. The Hunt for Desrolles. When Desrolles left the village under the shadow of Dartmoor, after bargaining for a handsome annuity. He meant to enter upon a new and delightful stage of existence. The world was changed for him. Assured of a handsome income, he felt, as it were, new-born. He would rove, butterfly-like, from city to city. He would sip of one sweet, and then fly to the rest. All that was fairest upon earth was at his command. The loveliest spots in southern Europe should be the cradle of his declining years. He would leave off brandy and live decently. Henceforward he would have a full purse and freedom from care, for what tortures can conscience have in reserve for a man who has set it at naught all his life? Mr. Desrolles considered Paris as the first stage in that voyage of pleasure which he had planned for himself, but once having entered Paris, with money in his pocket and a sense of independence, all his schemes became as nothing when weighed against the fascinations of that wonderful city. He'd spent some of his most reckless years in Paris. He knew the city by heart, with all her charms, with all her vices, all those qualities which she possesses in common with the courtesans who spring from her soil. Paris, for Desrolles in his decline, had all the delight she had offered him in his youth. She stretched out her many arms to detain him and hold him like an octopus. Her life of the streets and the café, her dancing places, where the dancing began at 11 at night and ended only at some unearthly hour of the morning, her singing places, where bare-necked brazen women sat smiling in the glare of the gas, her wine shops at every corner, her billiard rooms over every café. All these were charms which for Desrolles proved irresistible. There was an all-pervading note of dissipation in the place that delighted him. In London he felt himself a scamp. In Paris he fancied himself little worse than his fellow men. There were differences, perhaps, but only differences of degree. Desrolles had come to Paris with the intention of curing himself of brandy. He carried out this resolve with laudable firmness. He cured himself of brandy by taking to absinthe. He entered Paris with £95 in his pocket and a promise of 1,000 a year. With the future so amply provided for, he was naturally somewhat reckless as to his expenditure in the present. He was not a man who cared for pomp or show. He had outlived his taste for the refinements of life. With his purse full of money, he had no inclination to put up at Meurice's or the Bristol. The elegant luxury of those establishments would have seemed fade to his perverted taste, just as brandy without the addition of cayenne pepper used to seem tasteless to a luckless English marquis who burned life's brief candle at both ends and brought it to speedy extinction. Desrolles, like the hare, wound back to his old form. Years ago he had lodged in the students' quarter and drunk at the students' cafés and lost his money among those profane young reprobates from whom were to issue the future senators, doctors, and lawyers of France. The lodging had been dirty and disreputable 20 years ago. It was so much the more dirty and no less disreputable after the lapse of 20 years. But Desrolles was grateful to Providence and the prefect of Vincennes for having left his old quarters standing. The house, beneath whose weather-worn roof he had spent such wild nights of old, had been spared from demolition by accident only, and was soon to be numbered with the things of the past. Its doom was fixed. It existed only on sufferance, pending the complete reconstruction of the quarter. A mighty boulevard, marching on with progress as relentless as Juggernaut's car, had cut the narrow, dingy old street across at right angles, letting daylight in upon all its shabbiness, its teeming life, its contented poverty, its secret crimes, squalid miseries, and sordid vices. The house in which Desrolles had lived had but just escaped demolition. It stood at the corner of the broad, new boulevard, where mighty stone palaces were being raised upon the ashes of departed hovels. Its next-door neighbor had been razed to the ground, and the gaudy papers that had lined the vanished rooms were revealed to the open day, showing how, stage by stage, the rooms had waxed shabbier, lower, smaller, till on the 6th story they had dwindled to mere pigeonholes. The ragged paper rotted on the wall, black patches showed where the fireplaces had stood, and a great black column marked the course of a demolished chimney stack. This outside wall had been shored up, but even thus supported, the tall, narrow corner house, contemplated from the street below, had an insecure look. Desrolles was delighted to find his ancient den still standing. How well he remembered the little wine shop on the ground floor, the bright-colored bottles in the windows, the odor of brandy within, the blouses sitting on the benches against the wall, squabbling loudly over dominoes, or playing écarté with the limpest and smallest of cards. He inquired in the wine shop if there was une chambre de garçon, a bachelor's room, to be had upstairs. "There's always room for a bachelor," answered the buxom female behind the counter. "Yes, there is a pretty little room on the 5th story, all that there is of the most commodious, où monsieur aurait tous ses aises." Desrolles shrugged his shoulders dubiously. "The 5th story!" he exclaimed. "Do you think my legs are as young as they were 20 years ago?" "Monsieur looks full of youth and activity," said the woman. "Does la veuve Chamard still keep the house?" Alas, no. The widow Chamard had departed some 9 years ago to the narrowest of houses in the cemetery of Montparnasse. The present proprietor was a gentleman in the commerce of wines, and also the proprietor of the shop. That made nothing, Desrolles told the woman. All he wanted was a comfortable room on the 1st or 2nd floor. Unhappily, the chambre de garçon on the 5th stage was the only unoccupied room in the house, and after some hesitation Desrolles followed an ancient female of the portress species up the dirty old staircase and into the chambrette. "That gives upon the new boulevard," said the portress, opening a small window. "C'est grandement gai. It is awfully lively." Desrolles looked down upon the broad new street, with its omnibuses and wagons and builders' trolleys circulating up and down, its monstrous scaffolding and lofty ladders, and workmen dangling between earth and sky, with an appearance of being in immediate peril of death. The room was small, but to Desrolles' eye it looked snug. There were comfortable stuff curtains to the mahogany bedstead, curtains to the window, a carpet on the red-tiled floor, a hearth on which a wood fire might burn cheerily, a cupboard for firewood, and a bureau with a lock and key, in which a man might put away a bottle or two for occasional use. "It's an infernal way up," he said. "A man might as well live on the top of the gate of Saint-Denis. But I must make it serve. I'm a staunch conservative. I like old quarters." Of old the house had been free and easy in its habits. A lodger could come in at any hour he liked with his pass-key. Desrolles made an inquiry or two of the portress as to the present rule. He found that the old order still obtained. The present proprietor was un bon enfant. He asked nothing of his lodgers but that they should pay him his rent and not embroil themselves with the police. Desrolles flung down the small valise which contained all his worldly gear, paid the portress a month's rent in advance, and went out to enjoy his Paris. That enchantress had him in her clutch already. He made up his mind by this time that he would defer his journey southward for a few weeks, perhaps until after the procession of the Boeuf Gras had delighted the lively inhabitants of the liveliest city in the world. He went back to his old haunts, loved 20 years ago, and always remembered with fondness. He found many changes, but the atmosphere was still the same. Absinthe was the one great novelty. That murderous stimulant had not attained a universal popularity at the beginning of the Second Empire. Desrolles took to absinthe as an infant takes to the gracious fountain heaven has provided for its sustenance. He renounced brandy in favor of the less familiar poison. He found plenty of new companions in his old haunts. They were not the same men, but they had the same habits, the same vices. and Desrolles' idea of a friend was a bundle of sympathetic wickedness. He found men to gamble with and drink with, men whose tongues were as foul as his own, and who looked at life in this world and the next from the same standpoint. His brutal nature sank even to a lower depth of brutality in such congenial company. Money gave him a temporary omnipotence. He was spending it with royal recklessness, believing himself secure against all future evils, when one morning chance flung an English newspaper in his way, and he read the report of John Traverton's first appearance at the Bow Street police court. The paper was more than a week old. The adjourned inquiry must have been held a day or two ago. Desrolles sat staring at the page in a half-stupid wonderment, his brain bemused with absinthe, trying to consider what effect this arrest of John Traverton might exercise upon his own fortunes. There was no mention of his own name in the report. So far he was entirely ignored. So far he felt himself safe. Yet there was no knowing what might happen. An investigation of this kind once commenced might extend its ramifications in the widest directions. "It is a pity," Desrolles said to himself. "The business was so comfortably settled. It must be the parson's son, that young coxcomb I saw in Devonshire, who set the thing moving again." His life in Paris suited him. It was indeed the only kind of life he cared for. Yet so much was he disturbed by the idea of possible revelations to which this new inquiry might lead, that he began to consider the prudence of going further afield. "America is the place," he said to himself. "Some sea-coast city in South America would suit me down to the ground. But that kind of life would only be comfortable with an assured income. And how am I to feel sure of my income if I leave Europe? As to Traverton being in trouble, I can afford to take that coolly. They can't hang him. The evidence against him is not strong enough to hang a mongrel dog. No, unless other names are brought up, the thing must blow over. But if I put the high seas between Mr. and Mrs. Traverton and me, how can I be sure of my pension? They may snap their fingers at me when I am on the other side of the herring pond." This was a serious consideration, yet Desrolles had a lurking conviction that it would be wise for him to get to America as soon as he could. Paris might suit him admirably, but Paris was unpleasantly near London. The police of the two cities were doubtless in frequent communication. He went to a shipping office and got the time bill of the American steamers that were to sail from Havre during the next 6 weeks. He carried this document about with him for 2 or 3 days and studied it frequently in his quiet moments. He knew the names of the steamers and their tonnage by heart, but he had not yet made up his mind to which vessel he could entrust himself and his fortunes. There was La Reine Blanche, which sailed to Valparaiso in a week's time. There was the Zenobie, which sailed for Rio Janeiro in a fortnight. He was divided between these two. He told himself that he must have an outfit of some kind for his voyage. This and his passage would cost at least £50. Of the 100 which John Traverton had given him, he had only 60 remaining. "There will not be much left by the time I get to the south," he said to himself. "But I don't think Laura will throw me over. Besides, if the money is paid to my account in Shepherd's Inn, the Travertons never need know my whereabouts." He made up his mind at last that he would go by the Reine Blanche, the ship which sailed earliest. He went to the Belle Jardinière and laid out £10 upon clothing, and bought himself a portmanteau to hold his new garments. He called at the agents to take his passage and pay the necessary deposit to secure his berth. He had intended to go to the New World with a new name, but exhausted nature had required a good deal of stimulant after the purchase of the outfit, and by the time he reached the office Mr. Desrolles was, in his own phraseology, rather far gone. It was as much as he could do to reckon his money when he took a handful of loose gold and silver from his pocket. The clerk had to help him. When the clerk asked his name, he answered without thinking, "Desrolles." But in the next moment A ray of light flashed through the darkness of his clouded brain, and he corrected himself. "Beg pardon," he ejaculated spasmodically. "Desrolles, a friend's name. My name's Mowbray, Colonel Mowbray, citizen United States. Just finished a grand tour of Europe. Americans very fond of Paris. Charming city. Good deal altered since my last tour, 20 years ago. Not altered for the better."
"Oh, then your name is not Desrolles, but
"Mowbray," said the clerk, scanning the American colonel somewhat suspiciously. "Yes, Mowbray. Mowbray, answered Desrolles laboriously. He left the office, and being too far gone to have any definite views as to his destination, drifted vaguely to the Palais Royal, where he came to anchor at the Café de la Rotonde, and there called for the usual dose of absinthe, into which he poured half a tumbler of water with a tremulous hand. He fell asleep in the snug corner by the stove, and slept off something of his intoxication, or at least he awoke so far refreshed as to remember an appointment he had made with one of his new friends of the Quartier Latin, to dine at a restaurant on the Quai des Grands Augustins. He had plenty of time to spare, so he sauntered round the Palais Royal, and stared idly at the shop windows, till he came to one where there was a great display of diamonds, when he recoiled as if he'd seen an adder, and turned quickly aside into the gravelly garden, where he flung himself upon a bench, trembling from head to foot. "Curse them," he muttered. "Curse those shining shams. They've ruined me, body and soul. I never took to drinking hard until after that." Beads of sweat broke out upon his contracted brow as he sat there, staring straight before him as if at some horrid vision. Then he pulled himself together with an effort, braced his shattered nerves, and left the Palais Royal with something of the old long-sword, saddle, bridle, swagger which had been peculiar to him 20 years ago, when he called himself Captain Desmond, and had not yet forgotten his youthful days in a cavalry regiment. He kept his appointment, treated his new friend like a prince, dined luxuriously, and drank deeply of the strongest Burgundy in the wine list, winding up with numerous glasses of chartreuse. After dinner, Mr. Desrolles and his guest repaired to a café on the Boulevard Saint-Michel, where there was a billiard table, and the rest of the evening was devoted to billiards, Desrolles growing noisier, more quarrelsome, and less distinct of utterance as the night wore on. There were two things which Mr. Desrolles did not know. First, that his new friend was a distinguished member of the Parisian swell mob, and was constantly under the surveillance of the police. Secondly, that he himself had been watched and followed by an English detective ever since he left the Quai des Grands Augustins, which English detective knew all about Mr. Desrolles' intended voyage in the Reine Blanche. Desrolles went home to his lodging, not too steady of foot, soon after midnight. He was prepared to encounter some slight difficulty in opening the door with his pass-key, and was pleased at finding that some other night-bird, returning to his nest a little earlier, had left the door ajar. He had only to push it open and go in. Within all was gloom, save in one corner by the portress' den, where a glimmer of gas showed the numbered board whereon hung the keys which admitted the lodgers to their several apartments. But Desrolles knew every twist of the corkscrew staircase. Drunk as he was, he wound his way up safely enough, with only an occasional lurch and an occasional stumble. He managed to unlock the door of his room, after trying the key upside down once or twice, and making some circuitous scratchings on the panel. He managed to strike a lucifer and light his candle, leaning against the mantelpiece as he performed that feat, and giving a drunken chuckle when it was done. But his nerves must have been in a very shaky condition, for when a man, who had crept softly into the room behind him, laid a strong hand upon his shoulder, he collapsed, and made as if he would have fallen to the ground. "What do you want?" he asked in French. "You," answered the intruder in English. "I arrest you on suspicion of being concerned in the murder of La Chicot. You know all about it. You were examined at the inquest. Anything you say now will be used as evidence against you. You'd better come quietly with me."
"I don't understand you," said Desrolles, still in French. "I am a Frenchman."
"Oh, very much of that. You've been lodging here 3 weeks. You are known to be an Englishman. You took your passage today for Valparaiso. I called at the office to make inquiries an hour after you left. No nonsense, Mr. Desrolles. All you've got to do is to come quietly with me." "You've got someone else outside, I suppose?" said Desrolles, with a savage glare at the door. His expression in this moment was diabolical. A wild beast, a beast of a low type, not your kingly lion or your lordly tiger, at bay and knowing escape impossible, might so look. The thin lips curling upward above the long shark's teeth, the grizzled brows contracted, the eyes emitting sparks of lurid light. "Of course," answered the man coolly. "You don't suppose I should be such a fool as to trust myself in a hole like this without help. I've got my mate on the landing, and we've both got revolvers."
"Ah, none of that now," ejaculated the detective suddenly, as Desrolles plunged his lean hand into his breast pocket.
"Stow that now.
Is it a knife?" It was a knife, and a murderous one. Desrolles had it out and the long-pointed blade ready before his captor could stop him. The man sprang upon him, caught him by the wrist, before the knife could do mischief, and then the two closed, hand against hand, limb against limb, Desrolles wrestling with his foe as only rage and despair can wrestle. He'd been a famous bruiser in days of old. Tonight he had the unnatural strength given to the overtasked sinews by a mind on the edge of madness. He fought like a madman. He fought like a tiger. There was not a muscle, not a sinew, that was not strained to its utmost in that savage conflict. For some moments Desrolles seemed the victor. The detective had lied when he said that he had help at hand. The French policeman who had planned to meet him at that house at midnight had not yet come, and the Englishman had been too impatient to wait, believing himself and his revolver more than a match for one drunken old man. He did not want to use his revolver. It would have been a hazardous thing even to wound his man. It was his duty to take him alive and surrender him safe and sound to be dealt with by the law of his country. "Come," he said soothingly, having hardly enough breath for so much speech. "Let me put the bracelets on and take you away quietly. What's the use of this humbug?" Desrolles, with his teeth set, answered never a word. He'd got his antagonist very near the door. Once across the threshold, a last vigorous thrust from his lean arms might hurl the man backwards down the steep staircase, certain death to the intruder. Desrolles' eyes were fixed upon the doorway, the door standing conveniently open. His bloodshot eyeballs flashed fire. It was in his mind that the thing was to be done. One more Herculean effort, and his foe would be across the threshold. Possibly the detective saw that look of triumph in the savage face, and divined his danger. However that might be, he gathered himself together, and with a sudden impetus, flinging all his weight against Desrolles, he drove his foe before him across the narrow room, hurled him with all his might against the wall, casting him loose for the moment, in order to grip him tighter afterwards. But as that tall figure fell with terrific force against the gaudy papered wall, there was a sudden crashing sound, at which the detective recoiled with a cry of horror. The frail lath and plaster partition split asunder. The rotten wood crumbled and scattered itself in a cloud of dust. Half that side of the room dropped into ruin, as if the house had been a house of cards. And with one hoarse shriek, Desrolles rolled backwards into empty air. They found him presently upon the pavement below, so battered and disfigured by that awful fall as to be hardly recognizable even by the eyes that had looked upon him a few minutes before. In falling, he had struck against the timbers that shored up the rotten old house, and life had been beaten out of him before he touched the stones below. It was a bad end
of a bad man. There was nobody to be sorry for him except the detective, who'd lost the chance of a handsome reward. The Parisian journals next day made a feature of the catastrophe. Fall of part of a house in the Boulevard Louis Capet. Horrible death of one of the inmates. The English newspapers of a later date contained the account of the pursuit and arrest of Desrolles, his desperate resistance, and awful death. This ends Chapter 45. Epilogue to The Cloven Foot by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Epilogue. Mr. and Mrs. Traverton went back to Hazelhurst Manor, and there was much rejoicing among their friends at John Traverton's escape from the critical position in which the hazards of life had placed him. The subject was a painful one, and people in their intercourse with John and Laura touched upon it as lightly as possible. Those revelations about John Traverton's first marriage, his bohemian existence under an assumed name, his poverty, and so on, had created no small sensation among a community which rarely had anything more exciting to talk about than the state of the weather or the appearance of the crops. People had talked their fill by the time Mr. and Mrs. Traverton came back, for they had spent a month at a Dorsetshire watering place on their way home, for the benefit of Laura's health, whereby the scandal was stale and almost worn threadbare when they arrived at the manor house. Only one event of any importance had happened during their absence. Edward Clare, the poet, the man who sauntered through life hand in hand with the muses, dwelling apart from common clay in a world of his own, had suddenly sickened of elegant leisure and had started all at once for the Cape to learn ostrich farming, with the deliberate intention of settling for life in that distant land. "An adventurous career will suit me, and I shall make money," he told those few acquaintances to whom he condescended to explain his views. "My people are tired of seeing me lead an idle life. They have no faith in my future as a poet." Perhaps they are right. The rarest and finest of poets have made very little money. It is only charlatanism in literature that really pays. A man who can write down to the level of the herd commands an easy success. Herrick, if he were alive today, would not make a living by his pen. So Edward Clare departed from the haunts of his youth, and there was no one save his mother to regret him. The vicar knew too well that John Traverton's arrest was his son's work, and treachery so base was a sin his honest heart could not forgive. He was glad that Edward had gone, and his secret prayer was that the young man might learn honesty as well as industry in his self-imposed exile. To the exile himself, anything was better than to see the man he had impotently striven to injure, happy and secure from all future malice. Weighed against that mortification, the possible difficulties and hardships of the life to which he was going were as nothing to him. The year wore on, and brought a new and strange gladness and a deep sense of responsibility to John Traverton. One balmy May morning his firstborn son opened his innocent blue eyes upon a bright young world, arrayed in all the glory of spring. The child was placed in his father's arms by the good old Hazelhurst doctor, who had attended Jasper Traverton in his last illness. How proud my old friend would have been to see his family name in a fair way of being continued in the land for many a long year to come, he said. Thank God all things had worked round well for us at last, answered John Traverton gravely. In the ripeness and splendor of August and harvest, when the heather was in bloom on the rolling moor and the narrow streams were dried up by the fierceness of the sun, George Gerard came down to the manor house to spend a brief holiday, and it happened, by a strange coincidence, that Laura had invited Celia Clare to stay with her at the same time. They all had a pleasant time in the peerless summer weather. There were picnics and excursions across the moor, with much exciting adventure, and some risk of losing oneself altogether in that sparsely populated world. And in all these adventures, George and Celia had a knack of finding themselves abandoned by the other two. Or perhaps it was they who went astray, though they always protested that it was Mr. and Mrs. Traverton who deserted them.
"I shouldn't wonder if we came to a bad end, like the babes in the wood," protested Celia. "Imagine us existing on unripe blackberries for a week or so, and then lying resignedly down to die. I don't believe a bit in the birds putting leaves over us. That's a fable invented for the pantomime. Birds are a great deal too selfish. No one who had ever seen a pair of robins fight for a bit of bread would believe in those benevolent birds who buried the babes in the wood."
Being occasionally lost on the moor gave Celia and Mr. Gerard great opportunities for conversation. They were obliged to find something to talk about, and in the end naturally told each other their inmost thoughts. And so it came about, in the most natural way in the world, that one blazing noontide Celia found herself standing before a druidic table, gazing idly at the big grey stones half embedded in heather and bracken, with George Gerard's arm round her waist, and with her head placidly resting against his shoulder. He had been asking her if she would wait for him. That was all. He had not asked her if she loved him, having made up his own mind upon that question, unassisted. "Darling, will you wait for me?" he asked, looking down at her, with eyes brimming over with love.
"Yes, George," she answered,
meekly, quite a transformed Celia, all her pertness and flippancy gone. "It may be a long while, dear," he said gravely, "almost as long as Rachel waited for Jacob."
"I don't mind that, provided there is no Leah to come between us."
"There shall be no Leah." So they were engaged, and in the dim cloudland of the future, Celia saw a vision of Harley Street, a landau, and a pair of handsome greys.
"Doctors generally have greys, don't they, George?" she asked presently,
apropos of nothing particular. George's thoughts had not travelled so far as the carriage and pair stage of his existence, and he did not understand the question. "Yes, dear, there's a free hospital in the Gray's Inn Road," he answered simply. "But I was at Bartlemy's."
"Oh, you foolish George! I was thinking of horses, not hospitals. What colour shall you choose when you start your carriage?"
"We'll talk it over, dearest, when we're going to start the carriage." Mr. and Mrs. Traverton heard of the engagement with infinite pleasure, nor did the vicar or his easy-tempered wife offer any objection. Before the first year of Celia's betrothal was over, John Traverton had persuaded the good old village doctor to retire, and to accept a handsome price for his comfortable practice, which covered a district of 60 miles circumference and offered ample work for an energetic young man. This practice John Traverton gave to George Gerard as a free gift. "Don't consider it a favour," he said, when the surgeon wanted it to be treated as a debt, to be paid out of his future earnings. "The obligation is all on my side. I want a clever young doctor whom I know and esteem, instead of any charlatan who might happen to succeed our old friend. The advantage is all on my side. You will help me in all my sanitary improvements, and my nursery will be safe in the inevitable season of measles and scarlatina." Thus it came to pass that Celia, as well as John Traverton and his wife, was able to say, "But in some wise all things wear round betimes, and wind up well." The end. This ends Epilogue. This ends The Cloven Foot by Mary Elizabeth Braddon.